You gotta be kidding me.
No guns, no killing.
Where's the fun in that?
I have given a name to my pain. The Batman.
Always waiting for some Batman to save you.
It's simple. We kill the Bat of Gotham. You don't really think you'll win, do you? I'm Batman.
Hello and welcome to episode 139 of the Batman on Film podcast. BOF is the sponsor as well as a proud member of the Batman Podcast Network. Check out all the shows over at batmanpodcastnetwork.com and follow our Twitter at BatPodNetwork. If you're listening to us on iTunes, if you take the time to rate and review the show, we'll read it on the air. BOF is also now on Patreon. If you like what we do here at BOF, whether it's the podcasts, vlogs, or the website itself, and you want to help support us if you're so inclined, please head over to patreon.com/BatmanOnFilm and sign up. I'm your host, Ryan Haas, and I am extremely excited for today's episode because it's one of those shows I like to refer to as an evergreen episode because it's one of those discussions you should be able to listen to 1 or 5 or like even 10 years from now, and it should still hold up. I know that's pretty lofty, but I think it's true. And that topic is dissecting Batman's no guns and no killing rule, mandate, whatever you want to call it. And with a topic that heavy, I wanted to do something a little different tonight and get a panel of really well-spoken and well-read comic fans from across the podcasting world. So with the first introduction here, we have longtime BOF alumni, Chris Clow. How is it going, Chris?
It's not going too bad, Ryan. How are you doing?
Oh, good.
Thanks for the invitation.
You are welcome. Yeah, whenever we were talking about this, I was like, the first person I got to ask is Chris because it's always really great to talk about this kind of stuff with you, you know? So,
well, I appreciate that. Hopefully, we were talking off air about performance anxiety. Be careful,
exactly.
Man.
I said, this is going to be the end all be all discussion of this topic. So, it's not on my shoulders. It's on yours. And it's on the other two guys we have with us today. The first of which I am super excited to introduce is Jay Yaws from Comics Now and the Everyone Loves the Young Justice podcast. What's up?
Hey, Ryan, thanks very much for having me on this extra special show.
You are welcome. I am super excited to have you on the show. We talk on Twitter all the time, and you just kind of pop up in the mentions. And whenever you do, it's usually something like super smart or super comic book history related. So I was like, you would be perfect to have on this show.
I appreciate that and hope you're not teeing me up too high.
We will all
come
together to have a good discussion here. And last but not least, we have another in addition to Jay, his first time on a BOF podcast is Scott McClellan from the Suicide Squadcast. How's it going?
It's going just fine. I was so shocked when I got an email saying, "Hey, you want to do something?" And I was like, "Me?"
Well, your podcast is great, and I listen to it. I know a lot of our BOF pals. I know there's a lot of crossover between some of the shows here, so I'm hoping that there's somebody that listens to all of us, or there's some listeners out there that listen to one or two of the shows, and it's going to be one of those crossover shows, but in a kind of a different context, I'd say, with a discussion like this.
Oh, absolutely, because I think it's going to be interesting, because with a topic with a 80-year time frame to work with, we all have our own various knowledge bases from all the different kinds of media that Batman's in, and it's going to be really interesting to see where are our strengths, where are our gaps, and how do we all kind of fill in each other where what we all know and don't know. It's going to be fun.
Yeah,
that's a good point, Scott.
Yeah,
excited. Definitely.
Yeah, so since Jay and Scott, it's their first time on the show, I wanted to give them each the floor for a second at the top of the show to kind of plug their respective podcasts and kind of have the listeners kind of get to know them for a little bit. So, Jay, tell everybody about what you are doing.
I am the co-owner of Comics Now. It is we are on the web at comics-now.com. Started about a year ago. It's around the 1 year anniversary. Sometime this month. I can't remember the exact date, but me and Brian Warshaw, he's the other owner. We write about Batman and comic stuff all over the place, but it always bandied about having our own podcast. So we kicked that off and decided to have a website where we could throw up press releases and our own reviews and everything. So that's what we have there with our site. The podcast is just called Comics Now. So if you want to go find that, we would appreciate it. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Comics Nowcast. We're on Facebook. Just search for Comics Now. We're also on Patreon, if I can give that little plug there. We've set up a page about 2 months ago, and looking forward to getting some patrons here. And that's just patreon.com/comicsnow. And like Ryan said, I'm also on Everyone Loves Young Justice with Rob Myers. So if you're a fan of Everyone Loves the Drake, which Ryan is also on, then check that out. Me and Rob, we've got a couple of episodes up published already, and a couple more in the can, just waiting to be published. So go check us out over there too.
Cool. And what about you, Scott? The Suicide Squad. It's like its own little podcast like empire right now. You've got a lot of stuff going on.
Well, it's kind of fun. I am a co-host and co-founder of the Suicide Squadcast and the Suicide Squadcast Network. The OG show, which has been around actually sorry, I had to, but has been around 4 years this year, actually. Was started mainly as a news and review show for the DCEU films. And that's kind of where we got started with my co-host Tim and myself. And since then, it basically, between that and the TV and everything, there just got to be too much to talk about every week. And so we just started, started hiring people. It's like, you're going to start a show, so we don't have to talk about this on our show, but we don't give it short shrift. So then we were able to branch out into the DC TV Squadcast and DC Comic Squadcast. And then we eventually led to a in general geek show, Fans Without Borders. So we like to think that if you come to our network, we got a show for somebody. You don't even have to listen to all of us, because we don't even listen to all of our own shows. And you
don't make fun of each other on
never
shows
do we ever make fun of each other. And that has led to some interesting little host wars between each other, because we know how to. When you've worked together for so long, you know how to push each other's buttons, and we push them so well. But you can find us on Twitter at Suicide Squadcast, and I'm on Twitter at ScottDC27. You can find us on Facebook, and we have a Patreon as well. And we like to plug that we do regularly produce original content that we put there, including B-roll, side discussions that maybe are not safe for work, since we like to stay family friendly on our show. And we also have a entire movie Squadcast show exclusive to Patreon, where we are reviewing every comic book superhero movie ever made.
Which one are you up to right now?
We interestingly enough, we just released Howard the Duck.
Okay, so you're a little bit away from Catwoman.
No, well, we alternate. Our even number episodes started in 1998 with Blade. Well, that's our odd numbers, and then our even numbers go all the way back to the beginning with Superman the Mole Men. So we just did Howard the Duck, so our next episode is going to be Ang Lee's Hulk.
Fantastic movie.
Hey,
some people love it.
Radioactive Poodles, what can I say?
Yep. There's a comic book basis for that.
It is better than Catwoman. I'll say that.
Amen to that.
Most movies are.
Heck, Howard the Duck is better than Catwoman. So
I'm gonna have to wait. I'm gonna hold judgment until I have to go back and see that movie again. Just say
the only nice thing I can say about Catwoman is somehow it's not the worst movie I've ever seen. That is about the only positive thing I can say about that.
That's pretty ringing praise, though, considering what you're talking about.
Yeah, I know.
just
like
saying.
it's like I just can't get to the point where I say this is the worst movie ever made, but somehow it's not. It's close, but it's not. But anyway,
what is though? in your opinion? Do you have one that's just automatically on the bottom of your list?
I don't know.
There's probably a couple, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's some that are just like so inept that it's like, I don't know. I'd have to think about that. For right now, it might be Catwoman, just so we can move on. Just so we can move on.
Let's put a button on this, and then we can
To a dark place. This line of thought will carry us.
That can be the next Batman on Film episode. Is what is Jay's pick for the worst movie ever made?
I've threatened to do a Catwoman commentary for years. It was all Rick Shue's fault. He started bringing it up.
God, we're talking about this like it's capital punishment. We're going to inflict this on you if you're not careful.
I'm the masochist of the group because I own an embarrassing number of copies of both the movie and the video games. So I'm not one to talk
Never
about
played that.
it. So
Never
it's
played
actually it's actually not that bad. It's better than the movie, which of course is not saying much.
Is it better than Constantine the game?
I haven't played Constantine the game.
Ooh, you should. Give it a try.
What's it on? What platform is it on?
Xbox, PS2. I think it might have. No, I think it skipped the GameCube, but might be on there.
That's probably why I didn't play it.
It's got a pretty kooky Keanu Reeves sound-alike who doesn't quite.
No,
nail
that's
him,
amazing.
I mean, it's worth playing just to hear.
It's like that. It's like that's what's in my head.
They call it the balance.
Oh man,
it's.
I have to rewatch that. Cool. So here we are. I mean, it's this year, 2019, is the 80th anniversary of Batman, and it couldn't be a better time to have one of these deep dive discussions into his history and lore and legacy and all that kind of stuff. And so, first of all, I kind of wanted to talk about why we're talking about this. It seems like, we're all on Twitter. There's Twitter. It's a thing. There's Twitter wars and Twitter discussions and conversations, and Twitter is not exactly the best place to have discussions like this, despite discussions like this happening on a consistent basis. So every once in a while, something will kind of trigger this discussion. I think most recently because Ben Affleck recently decided, or didn't, I don't know, announced officially that he's done with the role of Batman. That kind of brings up these feelings in people to start defending him or whatever, and then this discussion of Batman's no guns, no killing rule kind of reared its ugly head again, and kind of got people talking about it, and it was just kind of a flurry of back and forth I just saw across my timeline for a little bit, and I was discussing a little bit or reading some of the things, and I was just like, this would be a really good podcast because I think it's a discussion that needs the nuance and needs the calm level-headedness as much as a geek discussion can get. And I reached out to all three of these guys. I was like, "Are you interested in doing this?" And they all said yes. And then I went on Twitter on my account and I did a little poll, just to kind of gauge interest too. Although we'd already decided to record the show. I wanted to see what people thought, and 99% of the replies were like, "Oh, please do this show. I really want to listen to it. It'd be super interesting." That it's not something that shows devote a whole episode to or anything like that, because to be honest, these philosophical like debate type discussions are pretty hard. I mean, especially with a character that's got as deep of a history as Batman. So kind of want to get your guys' take on what we're talking about before we talk about it, if that makes sense.
Well, I think one of the things to discuss is the fact that this should really be, and I think with the four of us, it's going to be a discussion. It's not like any of us are trying to win against the other ones. Like the four of us aren't locked in Mortal Kombat in this topic. I feel like that it's a historical topic that has some truly historical roots about why certain decisions were made. But then also, as an English teacher, I always like to say, you learn the rules so you can break the rules. And then the question becomes, how well did you break the rule? And so I think it's just there, like you said, Ryan, there's nuance to this topic that Twitter tends to turn into a very dualistic mindset of either yes or no. And it's like, well, maybe it lives in the gray, and we can talk about the shades of gray that are associated with this topic throughout 80 years of canon.
Yeah, and I the way I'm coming at it, and I'm sure the way you guys are coming at it too, isn't has Batman killed before in any medium whatsoever, because
that's an objective answer that I can point
it's objective. It's happened one way or another.
I can give you like 5 examples off the top of my head right now that probably happened in the past 20 years across all media and everything. So it's not has Batman killed, it's should he kill, and if he shouldn't, why shouldn't he, and if he should, under what circumstances should he. So like you were saying, Scott, I think that this is definitely something that you can make your point and case on Twitter, even if amongst us who have at least interacted with each other before, you can make your point and it may come across the way that you intended and be received the way you intended. But even then, there's going to be somebody who doesn't read it the way that you intended, and then it's just going to snowball into arguments and debates and name calling and all sorts of misunderstandings that nobody really wants to get wrapped up in to begin with. So I'm looking forward to this just because, I have a general, firm stance of, where I stand on this topic. But I'm also willing to, maybe be swayed a little bit for maybe a part of the history of Batman that may be a blind spot to me, or maybe something that I'd never considered before.
And I think that's an interesting point that you bring up, is that I think too many people want to make an argument saying the character is this way. And I could argue, yes, he is this way, but he's also this way and also this way, depending on what era you're talking about, which medium you're talking about, which interpretation you're talking about. And I guess for me, it always boils down to, I have this general idea of what I think, most stories will follow. But if you're going to break the rule, it's like, cool, show me what you got. Where are you going with this?
Make it worth it. That's my edict.
Yeah, and sometimes I've seen it where it's worth it, and even up to some recent examples that I was reading in comics, going, that didn't deliver the way I thought it was going to. But it's always like, I don't prejudge it. I go into it going, what you got? What were you trying to do as a writer? What was your theme? What kind of story were you trying to tell? Does it serve the story you were telling? And then I will judge it based on that, which can be a very case-by-case basis, instead of having this blanket of this is the way it is and this is the way it must always be.
Yeah, I think Roger Ebert used to always say, it's not what a movie's about, it's how it's about it.
Oh, I like that.
So it's always good to go into things like that.
When I try to wrap my own head around this, well, first of all, over the last few months, I actually just got a new job, so I haven't been nearly as plugged into fandom as I normally am, just because I've been doing a lot of learning in a relatively new field, and it's taken up a significant portion of my time. I feel like I've had to pedal pretty fast to keep up with my new responsibilities, but so I didn't really see how this particular iteration of the conversation was catalyzed, I guess.
Yeah.
But when you hear a discussion enough times, which I think I have over the years, you start to recognize some pretty familiar notes. It's like going to a concert of greatest hits, right? There are things that you see based on people's familiarity with source material, adaptive material. There are different kinds of exposures to the characters. How old they are is a surprisingly big factor that plays into where people stand on this issue, at least I've noticed. For me, at the end of the day, I have a relatively rigid stance on what I prefer to see from a Batman story, including what enters the equation when it comes to the issue of taking human life. But it also just kind of comes down to kind of what Scott and Jay were talking about previously. But I think it's even a little bit more simplistic for me in that it comes down to a feeling. I have a very, at least I think, keen, well-developed understanding of who Batman is. He is my favorite character in fiction, bar none. Sometimes Superman creeps up into that spot, but at the end of the day, it's Batman. And I've always stuck to that since I was a small child. And when a story is told the way that is most truthful to the vision that I perceive Batman to be, then those are the ones that usually resonate with me the most. If a question of life being taken enters that story, then I'm not going to be full hard stop at the rule to determine whether or not the story is good. Far from it. It will be how does he attack this situation? Does the way in which he attacked this situation feel truthful to him as I understand him to be? What are the external factors that play into this story? Is this mainline DC Universe Batman? Is this Frank Miller on steroids Batman? Is this Affleck Batman? Is this Adam West Batman? Probably going to be kind of a hard stop on the killing rule if it's Adam West Batman. But that's the thing, and Scott alluded to this earlier, is that this is a character who has seen so many different permutations and visions over the course of his entire history that hard rules very rarely apply to the concept, the large, wide, multimedia concept that is Batman, where there is more narrow perception regarding something like this, is that rests upon which vision of Batman is the story using to bring us on this narrative journey. And you can't treat every situation equally. That's true of any story, but it's really, really dependent on the vision of the character that's being presented and the rules that we understand for that vision as we go into the story. It's a lot easier to do if you've never seen a particular vision of Batman before. Something like White Knight comes to mind recently, because that was a new sort of... It leaned a little bit on what we understood from the comics and from some of the movies, but it was still a largely new vision of Batman for a specific story. So not as many rigid rules there as you would go into Batman number 64 that came out, this past week or thereabouts.
Yeah, well, that also brings up an interesting point that I think Brian maybe alluded to, or I think even you alluded to when you talked about people's ages and stuff. It's also kind of like when you gestated into your Batman fandom, what were the versions that were indicative of your birth in the fandom? Because within a 3-year period for me, I was able to be exposed to Adam West, Michael Keaton, Tim Burton, and the animated series within like a 3-year period. And
that's me to a T as well. And I think that's part of this discussion because Batman is so malleable. He's also like a multi-generational character, and because he has forms that both children and adults can experience, like a time period, especially like the one you just said, Scott, where you have the Burton movies and the 60s show and the animated series. As a kid, for me, I experienced all three of those things at the same time, so that provided this foundation of it's all Batman. And although he kind of killed people in the 89 movies and Returns, the other two things he didn't, and it wasn't so much of a focus in those other two Burton movies that it seeped into my subconscious too much. And again, because it's kind of made for kids, of course they kind of stay away from that stuff anyway, apart from it not really being intrinsic to the character that he doesn't use guns or kill.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the things that Chris hit on there that is a big part of what I was wanting to come into this with as well is what are the core foundations of the character that need to be there for him to be identifiably Batman? Because, obviously you've got the murder of the Waynes. That's what starts his entire journey to becoming Batman. So that's obviously a core foundational aspect of the character. But then if you have him, start flying and having super strength and everything, it's like, oh, well, he's not Batman anymore. He's just Superman. And we're reading that speeding bullets Elseworlds story or whatever it was. So, I mean,
I like that story, by the way. So no shade on that story.
No.
It's my first Elseworlds story I ever owned. So I'm just
Jerry Ordway's Joker Luthor still creeps me out to this day.
Oh man.
Yes.
It's a really good story. I mean, some Elseworlds stories are just kind of whatever, but I mean that one's a solid one. So I was
but that's a good
example.
It's a great example.
That's Elseworlds is a very good example too, because if you want to examine speeding bullets Clark Kent versus Red Sun Bruce Wayne, they're obviously very, very different. It's like playing around the arpeggios in a song, right?
Yeah.
There is a little bit of a familiar notation, but when you get down to the specifics, very, very different songs. And no one would bat an eye at Red Sun Batman killing people because of the environment in which he grew up, the environment that forged him into who he is. But then you compare that to another vision of Batman that we know much better, like the animated series or the Nolan films, which I'm sure will come up in this conversation.
Oh yeah.
Then just a different set of rules apply.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I kind of interrupted Scott, where you were kind of mid thought there when you were talking about what you experienced when you first got into Batman.
Well, I introduced that just as a way, I think, for the listeners to understand that I think there needs to be a certain sort of baseline, like maybe where do we all come from? Like that's, and I think that's important because it does inform maybe how flexible and or how rigid we are. And my point for my baseline was just saying I had 3 very different interpretations of Batman thrown at me in a relatively small amount of time, and forgetting to mention that I read Dark Knight Returns for the first time when I was 7 years old. Very poor life decision because...
Are you okay?
I wasn't for a while. Now it's like one of my favorite Batman books ever, which should also inform my personal taste in Batman literature. But once again, the idea that between the ages of 7 and 10, I've got Adam West, Tim Burton, Paul Dini, Bruce Timm, and Frank Miller all like in this cacophony stew that is like, wow, Batman can, kind of like what Chris is saying. There are things that I can look and go, okay, that's Batman. And these are things that will always be Batman. But then that also allowed me at this very impressionable age to go, but the rest of the stuff can kind of, you can kind of hear your musical chairs mixing and matching, because I had so many different versions thrusted at me so early on that my brain just was kind of open to, okay, what you got? So I was just kind of curious, like with Ryan said his experience was pretty similar to mine. We're probably about the same age. So I'm kind of curious for Chris and Jay, like what are those for you? Or are we all of the same age that we're kind of dealing with the same, sandbox here? Yeah,
I came into Batman fandom maybe I think we all sound like we're around the same age. I'm going to turn 34 later this year. The first bit of media that got me into Batman was actually Batman Forever. It was the first movie that I saw in the theater. I'd seen some of the Batman animated series episodes before, just because, I liked watching cartoons after school and it was always on, but I just nothing really grabbed me until I saw that, and then I was just into Batman and have been ever since then. But yeah, after that, I would track down as many episodes of the animated series as I could find. Watched especially Batman Forever over and over and over again, just because that was, my movie, quote unquote. And then just started reading a bunch of comics. The first big Batman story I remember reading was actually Night's End.
Man,
I
that's
had
great. This is good for this discussion.
Yeah, I had a kind of a primer of what went on during Nightfall and Night Quest, but I just went down to the bookstore one day and was told that I could pick out a comic book. So I got a trade of Knight's End and was introduced to like Nightwing and the return of Bruce Wayne to the Cape and Cowl and John Pal Valley and just all of this that just led me into reading as much as I could, actually getting into comics from there on out. So it was about 95, 96 is when all of this started happening with me.
Okay, well, so I turned, I turned 31 in December. So
right. And I turned 31 in November. So yeah, I remember you and me, Chris.
You and I are
pretty close.
pretty much right on the money there.
I'm the old man in this group then. I turned 37 next month.
You're in good company. I hear it only gets better from here, so not a problem. But I have it on good authority from the people who created me that the first Batman media I ever absorbed was at a Southern California drive-in in the summer of 1989 when I was 18 months old. My dad told me that I had my head out the window virtually the entire time. I guess the windshield was getting in the way. I don't know. But so I'm not sure. Obviously, I don't remember that. But if I had to try and go back to what I remember earliest, I don't know. I never made a distinction in the early years, and I guess I'm going back to like when I was 4. That's probably my first real cogent memory is from when I was around 4 years old. Everything was just Batman, Mm-hmm. Adam West was Batman. My VHS tape of Tim Burton was Batman. Joker was frightening on the VHS tape, and I remember always kind of hiding a little bit behind a blanket when he shoots Jack Palance. In the office scene. And the scene still creeps me out, but now I appreciate it a whole lot more.
Wait till they get a load of me.
Exactly. And the blood on the newspaper. Probably kind of a weird thing to watch when you're in preschool, but my parents also let me see both Terminator movies when I was that age. So, maybe they were a little too fast and loose with what they would allow me to see. But, Batman was a character that I immediately gravitated toward, as was Superman, but Batman just a little bit more. I would watch the 60s show whenever it was on reruns obsessively, and then when it was 92, so I was 5, I think. Thereabouts was when Batman the Animated Series first went on the air, but earlier that year, my grandmother and I went to the movie theater for Batman Returns. And I just distinctly remember other kids being in that theater who were older than me that were taken out of it crying. But this is the thing, and I always go back to this because, I don't have a lot of great feelings about Batman Returns these days, but back then, it never...
Which you can listen on this show, which we did a commentary
We
of.
did, and it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. In fact, we should just do it again sometime. I've joked we should just do it every year. And just
have
why not, right?
Rotating people on it. Or
Merry Christmas!
Chip Shrek is the greatest non-comics Batman character ever.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
And see, the next time we do it, we can all just do it in a walk-in impression so nobody can tell who's talking.
But that was the thing, is that this is how much Batman meant and still means to me, is that even though there were other kids that were being taken out of the theater, it never occurred to me to be afraid because my hero was there. So that there was always just this reassurance that I got. And I also have this memory one time, it was not long after, I was 7. We had just moved to another state. And it was just a few months later was when Batman Forever was released on VHS. And I had a bookcase at the edge of my room on the wall that I could see from my bed. And the moon was shining into my room, almost like it was shining onto that VHS copy of Batman Forever. And I was kind of afraid of the dark when I was 7 years old. In fact, for Christmas that year, I got a Bat Signal nightlight, which was awesome. But I remember looking at that tape and thinking in my head, and actually, I'm getting chills just thinking about it right now, hearing Kevin Conroy in my ear. As I couldn't get to sleep, I was just a little bit afraid of the dark, and he basically just told me, "Don't worry, I'm in the dark. And I slept like a baby. And that's, I think, the core thing that I love about Batman is that he is virtuous operating in the shadows. That's the core fundamental aspect of Batman that no other character, like every other character that tries to do that is just imitating Batman. It is Batman who is the virtuous hero who is operating in darkness to save people. And that's the thing that I've always appreciated. So when it comes to measuring what a good Batman story is in my own mind, it always comes back to the core question of heroism. What is he doing to help people? What is he doing to protect people?
That's an excellent point there too, because like you said, he's there to save people. So that's kind of where I come down on it is who did he save in this story? So glad you brought that up there.
And that's why I have problems with Batman Returns.
He saved people from that bomb on that guy.
Other people from the bomb.
Little abstract, but you're right. You're right.
As Obi-Wan Kenobi would say from a certain point of view.
Yeah. So we've all kind of established, where we come into this, but historically, I kind of wanted to get a little bit into why the rule is even there, why the no guns, no killing thing is even a thing, and why it stuck around for so long. And this is one of those things where there's a lot of history that goes into this, and we might need to fill in each other's gaps when we start talking about this from what we know or have looked up or whatever. But I think the first thing to note is that, Batman's been around for 80 years. He was created in 1939. And comic books was a very new format at the time. Comic books were new. And so when Batman was created, he took his cues from a lot of characters from the pulp books. And a lot of those characters were gun-toting vigilantes, right? So
the Shadow is a major inspiration.
Yeah,
exactly. Batman is a straight up rip off of the Shadow, pretty much.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, you take the Shadow, you take Zorro, and you take a couple other influences like the Bat, and
the Scarlet Pimpernel.
Exactly, and Sherlock Holmes and stuff. So, yeah, in terms of the gun-toting vigilante, the Shadow is definitely like the top example there. So, it, I guess, was kind of the thing to do at the time, all things considered. And you got to keep in mind, like, Bob Kane and Bill Finger and all the people writing and drawing these comics were kids at the time, and they were just kind of thrust into this new form of media, and they were just making it up as they went along, right? So,
well, but it also there's a key person of oversight that, I mean, this story. Really, if you want to look at it from like the business and operational point of view, the story begins in 1939 because not only did Detective 27 get published that year, but that was the year that Whitney Ellsworth was appointed the editorial director of National Comics, National Periodical Publications. So really it begins at Batman #1 because Bill Finger, who wrote most of the material in that issue, at least if memory serves properly, he basically got taken to task by Whitney Ellsworth because Batman was depicted as using a gun in that very first issue. I think Bob Kane even talked about it in his autobiography, that they had their first interaction with the censorship body, the self-imposed censorship body at National, over the use of the machine gun mounted on the Batplane. And
that's
Bill
the first
Finger,
Hugo Strange story, I believe.
Exactly.
Well, it wasn't the first Hugo. Hugo Strange had appeared in Detective before Batman #1, but it was in a Hugo Strange story.
It was in a Hugo Strange story. So Bill Finger got called on it by Whitney Ellsworth because he was worried that parents, mothers specifically, would not buy the National Comics anymore. So he basically instituted an editorial policy that said, you do not make Batman a murderer. Mothers aren't going to buy these books for their kids. And I think it was the year after
1940.
that.
Yeah, that happened.
Well, the issue came out in 40, but then in 41, that's when Ellsworth instituted the
mandate.
DC Comics Editorial Advisory Board, and he made an editorial policy that prohibited depictions of sex, language, bloodshed, torture, kidnapping, crime, and killing specifically.
And that is correct. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that what you just said is also pre-Comics Code.
Yeah, very pre-Comics Code.
Comics Code didn't show up until 54, so they operated as a self-regulating body.
Exactly.
Well, because you had Catholic decency leagues and that kind of thing, and that were operating that entire time, especially with like EC Comics and everything else, that were always kind of nipping at the heels. You always had somebody. I know a lot of people like to talk about Wortham, but there were people long before Wortham that wanted to make their bones on rallying against comic books as the corruption of the youth, and this. And it's amazing. I read there's
not much has changed, has it?
No, it really hasn't. And there's a really good book about this called The 10-Cent Plague that really details the entire process. When I read that, I didn't realize how early on, because we always hear about Wortham. We always hear about that particular Senate hearing. But to realize that this thing went on for decades, and it's like it never stopped, because you go back and you read those early issues of Detective, and he's wearing a pistol. He kills the bad guy at almost every issue, either flat out kills him or just refuses to save him. Punching a guy into a chemical vat and saying, well, he got what he deserved.
Exactly. Fitting into for his kind. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, there's, ones where he shoots a vampire at the end of the issue. Several bullet. He's got the gun and he shoots them. There's another one where the bat plane, he jumps on the ladder and saves the girl. And you actually see two guys in the car going, ah, as the car goes careening off of a cliff. So, I mean, first off, let's say for that first year of well, maybe not the first year because it was late 39, but he wasn't making a point of trying to save the bad guy at the end, and really was kind of merciless. But like Chris pointed out, it was in that Hugo Strange and the Monster story where he nooses a monster and strangles him to death. And he's got the machine gun, rat-a-tat-tat, and killing a monster off the top of a building a la King Kong. And it even has a caption that says, "Spitting death from the air, the Batman." I mean, it's like, it was weird to go back and read that going, whoo, doggy.
And it's
Bill. Yeah, I've got it right here. But out of the sky, spitting death, the Batman. And Batman says, as much as I hate to take human life, I'm afraid this time it's necessary.
Well, and another thing that I think is important to keep in mind is that, as Scott alluded to, comics were very much operating in something of a Wild West when it comes to, I guess, regulatory oversight. Because
as in none?
Right, yeah, exactly. But as, what was it? I think it was 1930 when the Motion Picture Production Code went into effect and started being rigidly enforced in 34.
Right, movies had the same thing. You hear a lot about film historians talk about pre-code movies.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, killing was allowed in those movies, but there was very specific regulations concerning profanity, anything sexual. The illegal traffic of drugs was a big thing. People couldn't have venereal diseases in movies because of the production code. There was much more of a willingness in society, and particularly American society, to try and regulate morality from the top down and interfere with artistic expression, I guess. I mean, something that just could not really, you could argue that it does happen today, but most of the time you're not going to have these strict guidelines concerning content for a motion picture unless it's particularly egregious, and then the MPAA will just threaten to put a rate. They won't say you can't release it, they'll just say here's a rating for it.
Here's a rating, yeah.
But back then, you couldn't get your movie out unless you actually observed the production code. And the Comics Code Authority was basically birthed off of a very similar philosophy, that we can create these rails on the bowling lane, so to speak, and keep these stories from inciting the youths into violence.
Well, actually, the Comic Code being a self-regulatory board, it was more survival from the comic book publishers going, we don't want to be driven out of business we know because we're having book burnings and our names being just plastered across newspapers because, with yellow journalism and particular publishers making it their hobby horse to really pounce on this. It was survival to go, we all need to agree to this set of rules or we're not going to be in business anymore.
Oh, I mean, it virtually killed DC. In the larger historical context, you could probably argue that DC came away relatively unscathed because they were already policing themselves.
Those early,
yeah. I mean, the Comics Code was basically a way to give Congress a cookie, and satisfy them that these were. I mean, Wortham, like I said, I don't like to give Wortham that much credit. All things considered, I read about as much of Seduction of the Innocent as I could stomach, quite literally.
It's way too long. It's way too long.
It's way too. He calls Superman as soon as he called Superman a fascist. I closed the cover. I mean, it's just an absolutely ridiculous charge that he labeled. But that was the thing, is that DC Comics stories, because they were already having this sort of self-imposed rule on the editorial board, they were able to survive and basically shift responsibility to this external thing that was a little bit more open to public interpretation and public discussion, and didn't really interfere, I don't think anyway, too much with the content of the stories, because by the time 1954 came around, Whitney Ellsworth already put the kibosh on Batman killing 13 years prior to that. Yeah. So that's when things, like after the Comics Code basically went away, that's when things started to get a little bit more interesting, but you also didn't really have a whole lot of other Batman stories outside of mainline DC Universe until even years after that.
And it wasn't even just Batman that was doing it either, because if you read a bunch of early Superman stories, he's not necessarily murdering guys like Batman would be, but he was very cavalier about who he saved. And which, I mean, looking back at the inspiration that the creators took it from, Kane and Finger took a lot of inspiration from, like The Shadow and Zorro, and Siegel and Schuster, looked to like a Doc Savage, like a two-fisted, barrel-chested adventurer who would go out and do all these fantastic feats and beat the bad guy in the end. And they were effectively just taking that storytelling template, getting very, very successful and popular with their own characters off of it, and then just telling these stories the way they knew how. Because, like we were saying, this is a brand new medium that it's in its infancy, that everyone's trying to figure out what to do with and how it should work. And then once there were those restrictions on them, I would argue that it was because of that these characters, Batman, Robin, Superman especially, actually became the characters that we would recognize today as Batman and Superman, as opposed to the early adventures, which are still important in their history, but it's really not beneficial to point at that very specific point in time and say, well, this is why this works for this character because they did it then. There's just...
Or they did it first.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So...
well, you've also had storytellers, brave storytellers, who come out and actively question the notions that were introduced by not only the Comics Code, but by the DC Comics editorial board back in the day. Like, why is this the way that it is? Is it actually going to lead to a story that fulfills the purposes of these characters? I mean, obviously the core purposes of the characters is to make DC Comics money.
Right.
But within the stories, if there's not a reason for these rules to exist, then as they progressed further into different decades and different eras, a lot of the more arbitrary ones fell away, except for this one.
This one, I think there's a lot of reasons why it does remain.
Yeah. Exactly.
Because it does allow for good stories. I mean, if you can just kill the bad guy at the end of the story, one, let's be honest, we wouldn't have a rogues gallery.
Yeah, exactly.
Why would you keep these people alive? Especially with a character like Batman and the villains he has. And also the fact that it does require a writer to be more creative in their solutions at the end of the day. because if you can't just flat out kill them, then how are you going to tie it up at the end?
Yeah, and
Well, it requires the characters to be more creative in their solutions too.
And a lot of this is looking back over 80 years of history and knowing what we know and feel about the character and what we think works and doesn't, and what is a core tenet of their motivation and backstory. But with Batman especially, you look at if he's going to go and kill the Joker at the end of the story, that's the end of it. There's, no more Joker. Right. From a financial standpoint, of course, the Joker is an incredibly popular character. You can't use the Joker anymore after that. If the Joker maybe falls thanks to his own, falls at his own hand, or gets caught up in some other machination that Batman didn't cause, but he maybe died, and it says, "Is this the end of the Joker?" Stay tuned to find out. Much more interesting.
The issue next month.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, but also too a matter of story simplicity, I guess. I mean, if Batman's got a clear line of sight 300 yards in front of him and sees the Joker in a secure compound, or one round out of a sniper rifle is a far less interesting story than breaking into a compound and going through an army to get his hands around the Joker's throat.
Right.
But why is the Joker
it's just a core fundamental tenet.
And why is the Joker in that compound? Because Batman believes in the reformation of his villains.
Yes.
But like we've been saying, it makes for much more interesting stories and much deeper characterizations for both the heroes and the villains.
Exactly, because when the villains know that, like when the Joker knows that, he can exploit it constantly.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's like a big tenet of their relationship. One other like interesting historical thing that I found that I wanted to bring up is that I've got this book called The Batcave Companion by Michael Urey and Michael Cronenberg, and they've got something in here reprinted from this was actually it's by Carmen Infantino, right? Legendary, head of DC and illustrator, and
he was pretty good.
And he's pretty good. And
I've heard his name once or twice.
Yeah, he wrote this eulogy basically for Bill Finger after he passed away, and this was published in 1975, just a few months after Bill Finger passed away, in a giant-sized reprint of Batman #1, and it's one of the, I think, earliest published things from DC that acknowledges that Bill Finger, did co-create Batman. Mm-hmm. But the thing that struck me as pretty interesting in it was that he mentions the Batman and the no guns and stuff, and I thought that was this was really interesting. The first thing he says is that the story with the Monster Men and Hugo Strange from Batman #1 was originally intended to be in Detective Comics 38, which, as we know, was the first comic book that introduced Robin. Mm-hmm. And they decided to swap them so that Robin would already have been introduced. So when they have their big Batman #1, you already have Batman and Robin in all the stories. And so that was kind of interesting, like, if this doesn't happen, maybe, the next thing doesn't happen kind of thing. But what he says is that, in this piece, is that the story of the Monster Maker, also in Batman #1, was originally intended for the issue of Detective Comics, which instead brought Robin to the public for the first time. The story was saved for Batman #1, and the reaction was not a good one. This marked one of the few times Batman was shown using a gun, and he even had some mounted in his Batplane. The readers didn't like their hero going around killing people. Bill got the message. Batman has since studiously avoided the use of firearms. And I thought that was interesting. Like, even though we know that there were also editorial things in the background too with Whitney Ellsworth, I thought that was interesting that even in the late 70s or mid 70s that Infantino brings that up as something that was, significant enough to mention there.
Yeah, I'd never heard that before. That is really interesting.
Yeah. So I wonder how, exactly how true or how much went into that. But I was thinking, like, that's actually an interesting window into, was there a little backlash at the time? I mean, we talked about it a little bit, but if they got a bunch of letters from readers that were like, we don't want to see a Batman like this, I wondered if that was actually part of the reason of influence in changing that.
And that's a good historical conversation to have because, like we've said, there has been enough examples of the pulp heroes where it wasn't like a hero carrying some automatic pistols were going to be terribly shocking, and it wasn't. And I even went back and I kind of quickly I have that Golden Age omnibus, and I just all I did like for the first 150 pages, I just flipped through it going. Just looking at, the Bob Kane and Jerry Robinson art, just kind of going, okay, how many times do I see a gun? Well, there's one. There's one. There wasn't a lot of guns. Like the gun thing was not that big of a deal because he barely had one. Did he have one? Yes. But it wasn't that prominent. It was more kill that. It was more like we've kind of alluded to before, like, you can take the no guns thing and the no killing thing, and this can be two separate conversations.
Yeah.
Because you look at those early runs, the gun thing doesn't show up a whole lot. Did he have one? Yes, but he didn't use that often. The no killing thing gets to be more of an issue because that's something that you can historically point to and go, that happened a little bit more often.
Yeah, and I mean, if you want to split hairs, Batman is not necessarily anti-gun because he has a, grappling gun that fires a grappling hook. It's more if he's against, lethal firearms.
Right.
But that's just being pedantic right there.
But it's worth noting, and because I think, Jay, something you said earlier was, people can't necessarily point to this early, like, let's just round up and say the first year of Batman and use this as justification. And I go, well, wait a minute. Let's just, I think what we need to be careful of is when people want to make these broad, generalizing, absolute statements that ignore nuance and caveats and opportunities for there to be a little tit for tat in these kind of conversations. I had a teacher who once had this beautiful quote on his wall that said, all generalizations are dangerous, even this one.
Yeah, and I didn't mean it like we should just completely ignore these. And I don't think you took it that way either. Just
no, not at all. I'm just following up on it going, there's somebody who heard what you said and took it not the way you meant it.
Right. Absolutely. And I appreciate you bringing it back up because, I mean, it's the same thing. Another one that comes up a lot is pointing to the 10 Nights of the Beast story where Batman leaves KG Beast to die at the end of the story. And, pointing to that and saying, well, he left KG Beast to die. And it's like, well, yes, but they quickly reversed that because they, the writers and editorial realized it was a bad idea to do it. So, it's not you should ignore this action that Batman had, but also recognize where it fits into the context of everything with the character in his history.
Right. And speaking of which, so we've gotten through most of all the early 40s type stuff, and it seems like once the 40s were kind of there and once World War II was over, comic books kind of shifted from these dark pulp inspired stuff, and that's when you start getting the goofier science fiction type stories. And because, like Chris was saying, DC was already kind of self-policing itself, once you then introduce things like the Comics Code, then the stories just get completely wacky.
Well, it's because you've got all the service members who've come home from World War II, which that was a boom for the comic industry, was, the Army and the Navy buying comic books and shipping them as care packages to the soldiers. And the deal is that once the war was over, what did all those guys do? Oh, they went home and went back to work. They didn't have time to be reading comic books, and that's when you get more of the mentality, including with the Comics Code. You definitely see a more shift of comic books are for kids.
Let's just have a brief moment of silence for all the Golden Age books that were destroyed after the war.
Jeez, for real. So and again, when I was talking about how those initial stories got swapped. Once you introduce Robin, if you have a Batman that kills people and has guns, it's not exactly the most compatible thing once you have a kid sidekick that gets introduced.
Right.
No, because that you're kind of going against the whole stated purpose of why you put a kid sidekick into the book. Like
Exactly.
And even
I love how Darwin Cook interpreted that in New Frontier as well.
Oh, yeah,
you know,
so
I mean, he just kind of solidified what was on an editorial side the reason for Robin being introduced, and he actually incorporated it into that Batman story. I thought that was a stroke of brilliance.
well, that's why Darwin Cook is a fantastic writer, and New Frontier is an excellent book.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it goes to the place of reform. You know, if Batman believes his villains can be reformed, he has this young child who experienced the same type of tragedy he did, and he wants to help mold and shape him into somebody that takes that tragedy and turns it into something positive. I always like the idea. I think people throw it around a lot. I think it was from the Young Justice TV series where Wonder Woman calls out Batman on, did you take this kid just so he would turn into you? And he said, no, I took him under my wing so he wouldn't. That's exactly, that's the same thing is, the villains have already, done heinous things and crimes, but Batman still believes they can be turned. So with Robin, you have somebody who, may very well go down a dark path because of this tragedy, but because he has someone like Bruce there to steer him, he becomes a hero just like his mentor does too. So it's kind of a two sides of the same coin thing going on there.
Right. And so eventually, like, as the years and decades pass, that's when these core tenets of the character really start to solidify. And after the comics code's been around for a while and everything, and when around the mid 60s, when the new look Batman started to happen, when we were getting out of the more science fiction and more cartoony looking stories, that's when you get the new look Batman, where that's where Comrade Infantino comes into it. That's where Batman's a little bit more realistic. That's when the stories change to kind of better reflect the kind of world that we're living in. And interestingly, when Julius Schwartz comes into that, his first story in Detective 327, one of the first things he does is he has Batman using a gun. And that was a complete accident, because he was like brand new to the book on the Batman side, and he didn't know that was a mandate, and that slipped through the cracks. And you can look up the panel. Batman's just boop, he's got a gun, and then he caught hell for it because everybody was like, "You can't have Batman holding it. Where have you been? This is a thing. You can't do it." And so if you can look up various points in time where it'll happen in comics, but for by and large it was pretty solidified. And of course in the 70s is when you get somebody like Denny O'Neil, when he comes in first as a writer and eventually as an editor, that kind of upholds those earlier mandates, but ends up, because Denny O'Neil was so instrumental in kind of reintroducing Batman and bringing him back to his dark roots, and from his and listening to some interviews and things that Denny O'Neil's written about this on his end, he kind of took all that history and tried to turn it into a positive, and looked at it in a way of he looked at the core of the character. That's where he found like this core that made sense to him, and to him it was like it's right there in the origin. Batman's parents get killed with a gun, and so that experience, of course, through the trauma, makes Bruce Wayne respect human life, and so he decides that there's a better way to avenge people, and through not using weapons. And in his mind, Batman's should be way scarier to the villains because he doesn't use a gun. Like, he doesn't even need a gun.
Yeah, exactly.
So I thought that was interesting, and that's the kind of thing that continues to populate, through him writing, and then as the group editor for the Batman books, and it just kind of keeps going. And that's how things like that become these giant core tenets of the character.
Well, and that's when you get into the Bronze Age in the 70s, going into the 80s, before you get into, what I like to refer to as the Dark Age in the 80s, right before the modern age. But that also allowed your stories to get more mature, which allowed these kind of discussions and these kind of talking points to get brought up in the stories.
Exactly.
Because what you have is they stopped with this mindset of comic books are just for kids, and they started to allow for the idea that older readership was still going to hang around. And then that's when you get stuff like, the Green Arrow, Green Lantern run, or even going back to Marvel, like the anti-drug stories where they rip the Comic Code Authority stamp off to like, no, because we're going to publish this story. And when the writers and editorial were allowed to kind of start being a little bit more loosey-goosey with what we were going to find as quote-unquote acceptable in a comic book, you can take these rules, and I think something Chris said earlier is that you can then say, okay, instead of it just being an editorial mandate, let's create an in-universe reason that these rules exist.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the in-universe reason for it is, like you were saying, Denny O'Neil took inspiration from, is a gun took Bruce's parents from him, and so therefore he just does not like firearms. He does not like the use of them. But also he is going on this crusade not for revenge or even vengeance necessarily, but to prevent a tragedy like this from befalling somebody else ever again.
Exactly.
Yeah, well said. I'm kind of curious to see what else, because Ryan, didn't you have some people ask you some questions about exactly this?
There were some questions, yeah. So we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but I did get a question from Dennis on Twitter at October Comics, and he said he ponders this issue all the time. Is there a point when Batman becomes partially responsible for all the people Joker kills because he refuses to put him down? In other words, is idealism more important than a permanent practical solution?
Ooh.
I think that's kind of wrapped up in a whole sort of, law enforcement and death penalty and all these things. I think that's sort of this larger question we have of, and I think it goes back to the idea of are these villains redeemable? Like, do you not kill them because you think at some point you can save them from themselves? And it also is
or if I kill, do I go down that same path?
Do I become them?
Yeah, I don't think that's as ironclad of an argument as a lot of people seem to think it is. I understand the point of it, but you have police officers out there who, will kill somebody if they have to, and they don't become that. So I don't think with Batman even you can go that far. What I actually just thought of this the other day, and it was something that I never really thought of before when thinking about this topic. But a lot of Batman's relationship with law enforcement comes down to a lot of plausible deniability. Jim Gordon can excuse Batman being a vigilante because, he may get up to a line, but he doesn't cross it. If he were to take the law into his own hands and start killing people left and right without due process, then he would no longer have that to fall back on. And even if Gordon didn't want to...
Even though he's okay with them being put in traction and probably being permanently crippled.
You see, this is actually I think a much simpler question, because the original question was, is Batman responsible if he doesn't kill the Joker and then the Joker goes out and kills 20 people, right? Wasn't that the question?
Yes,
right.
That was the question.
Basically, yeah.
It boils down to how much do you believe in someone being responsible for their own actions? The Joker is the one who committed those murders, not Batman. Batman doesn't have any real control. He's not a god. He can't exert this otherworldly control over another person's decisions. If you believe in personal responsibility, and if you believe in what you do, like that you are the driver of your own destiny, then just because the Joker kills someone because Batman didn't kill him, that doesn't automatically make Batman the one responsible for the Joker committing those murders. Right. It's the Joker who's responsible, and it's the Joker who needs to pay for it.
100%.
Right. But what's interesting is to see that, and it's easy for us to say, but what about poor Batman?
I think that's the
more interesting narrative.
Point, yes.
That's the dramatic question, right? Does he decide to take responsibility for that stuff? And really, at the end of the day, I was actually rereading Under the Red Hood
I was
going to
mention that.
And I mean, because this question comes up. But the thing that was more interesting to me is that after Jason Todd grabs the Joker by the scruff of his neck and puts the gun to his head, Batman, he throws Batman the gun. Jason throws Batman another gun and says, "You have to kill him or me." And Batman decides to walk away. And that to me was the most pivotal part of it, because he understands that it's Jason who would be committing that murder. It's not his responsibility necessarily to try and stop something from happening if someone is determined to do it themselves. Now, most of the time, Batman's going to try and intervene to try and make sure that someone is not going to die. But if it comes down to a situation like that, then trying to extrapolate backward and place the impetus of responsibility for someone else murdering another person on Batman is not a reasonable argument to make, because it's not Batman who committed the murder. It's the other person. And I think most of the time in the stories at the end of the day, he recognizes and really believes in the idea of someone who is responsible for their own destiny. And he tries to intervene in a protective sense, but that does not mean that he is responsible for a choice that someone else makes to either break the law or to kill somebody.
Well, and another example that I was reading tonight, because it did involve him having firearms, not lethal firearms, was I was reading The Cult by Jim Starlin. And at the end of that book, I mean, one, he comes traipsing into Gotham City at the end of the book in like a monster truck version of the Batmobile.
I'm sorry, Scott, remind me, that's Deacon Blackfire, right?
Yes, that's Deacon Blackfire,
okay.
yes. Yeah. Because it's the one where where Deacon's gotten like the entire homeless community of Gotham drugged and riots in the streets, and Batman has to come traipsing in like in a dune buggy monster truck version of the Batmobile with a rocket launcher, with machine guns that are, however, shooting tranquilizer darts. But at the end, in his final face-off between Deacon Blackfire, the sort of released from their brainwashing homeless people gang up and beat Deacon Blackfire to death. And Batman is kind of there. He's broken. He's bruised. He's coming off of withdrawals from the drugs themselves. And he looks at Jason Todd and basically goes, there's nothing we can do about it. Like, yes, he doesn't jump in the middle. He doesn't jump into the middle of the mob to stop them from beating Deacon Blackfire to death. But he also acknowledges there's nothing I can do about it. And, that was a situation out of his control. So he's also not beating himself up about the fact that he couldn't jump in the middle of a giant mob and save Deacon Blackfire.
Great. I'm so glad you explained all that, because I've read that. It's been a long time, but I did remember that guns and stuff were kind of a big part of that.
But it goes back to the feeling, right? Does this feel like it's in line with Batman? I would say that feels a whole hell of a lot more in line with Batman than him strapping a bomb to a circus strongman and smiling as he goes into a manhole. So yeah,
I mean, cool. But the thing is that Starlin even addresses it. Like Jason even says, "This feels weird using guns," and Bruce even goes, "Yeah, but we're two guys going up against literally an army. It's like we need a little bit of an edge." But they also make the point that they've got tranquilizer darts. Mm-hmm. They're using the mechanism of a machine gun, but something Jay brought up earlier, they're not using lethal ammunition in them. So that's kind of where you can kind of go, Starlin kind of walked that line. But it still felt like it worked. And once again, he hung a lantern on it and addressed the issue in the story.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Well,
go ahead.
I think a lot of that stuff goes back to, okay, well, how many times can you point to Batman using a gun that is loaded with a lethal bullet? Mm-hmm. And fires it at a living being. And those moments are very few and far between.
And there's a story point, and there's a reason we remember those stories.
Exactly.
Because that's why the story was being written. I mean, I would point back to Batman Year 2.
That's a big one.
You're going to open a can of worms if you go to the one that I was thinking of, that shows Batman loading a bullet into a gun to fire it at someone, but that is still intrinsically in line with who Batman is. And I know the BOF guys are going to love it when I say this. Final Crisis.
I was about to say Final Crisis.
Because he loads the God
This is
bullet.
an interesting example, yeah.
And he even says straight to Darkseid's face, normally I have a very strict rule against killing guns, but in this instance I'm going to make a once-in-a-lifetime exception. And he shoots Darkseid in the chest with the God bullet. And obviously there's a whole lot of other circumstances that surround the God bullet and Darkseid.
Technically doesn't even die, does he? It's been a while.
Well, that's the thing. Well, but Batman is probably reasonably sure that this mechanism that will stop Darkseid's plot, as he understands it, will probably not kill him. Like if he, it goes back to even Arkham Asylum, the game. I mean, he hits Bane with the Batmobile. You wouldn't do that to anybody else.
That moment is epic.
You scale, he scales the force that is required for the problem that is in front of him. And when Bane is the problem that's in front of him, Bane's not going to be killed when he's hit by even the most advanced car in the world.
Right.
But he's going to hurt him, and he's probably going to put him down for the count, at least in that moment.
But and using that same example, let's go to the in-boss level where you defeat the Titan hyped up Joker by putting plastic explosives on your fist. and punching him.
Boom.
Risking blowing your own arm off, but still putting that bastard down for the count. And that's the thing that comes back to the fundamental core tenet of this, is that the employment of what would normally be described or discerned as lethal force.
Military-grade weaponry.
But I mean, it scales for the conflict that's in front of him. So Batman hitting Bane with a car, or shooting Darkseid with the God bullet, or putting the plastic explosives on his fist, there's a fundamentally different feeling that comes with attacking problems like that compared with, let's say, using the front-mounted machine guns on the Batmobile to shred a car in front of you as it's trying to chase after kryptonite in a semi-truck.
And
very different situations.
And going back to the Darkseid thing, this may be reading into something that Morrison may not have even intended, but it's just something that I thought of, is you could see it as Batman effectively taking his last stand, saying...
I think that's exactly what he was going for.
If I am going to use a gun to kill somebody, I will no longer be Batman after this. There will not be a reason for me, and because he knows he's going into this he's not going to come out alive, and he even just stands there waiting for the Omega beams to hit him. So he is probably thinking, once I do this, it needs to be done.
There's no going back.
There's no going back. Until, he becomes a pirate and a pilgrim and a caveman and all sorts of stuff. And I love those stories. I love them. Morrison's Batman run so much. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But I mean, he's making that stand of once I do this, it is the last thing I will do as Batman. Like taking it to the literal, I will shoot somebody. I won't shoot somebody unless it's the last thing I do. He is literally saying that there, expecting that it is going to be his final act. And that's why, even if it's something that I don't like to see Batman doing, it at least makes sense within that story, which actually goes along with another question I saw on Twitter. I didn't know if you were going to segue into that or not.
Hold that question for a second, because what you were just talking about made me think of something like Batman using a gun as his last stand, or like, I'm not Batman after this. That the slightly more down to earth version of that is, you can see it in the premiere episode of Batman Beyond, is where you see Batman, and that's the one that always gets me, because that's showing you Batman.
He doesn't pull the trigger, but he needs the threat of the gun.
Right, exactly. So you follow this. The Batman that's at the beginning of Batman Beyond is Bruce Wayne. It's the Batman that you've grown up with, if you've grown up with Batman the animated series, and you see your hero. In the future, he's older. He has to have this upgraded suit to even like get around as Batman. Of course, taking some inspiration from The Dark Knight Returns a little bit there, and
And that's the power in that moment, right? Because
That's the story point.
When he's confronted with that and he realizes that this is what he needs in order to actually survive, the ultimate result of that is him saying never again.
Yeah,
never again.
Batman
Exactly. And I think
lost right there.
Yeah, like how and to him and I think that goes back to what Chris was saying is like in that moment Batman is probably like, this is my action. I am responsible for this. Never again. That's probably what went through his head. Like, I can't be Batman after this. Like, I'm done. And it's interesting that he was able to apply his own moral code there. There's a lot of other Batman stories where certain things have happened and he kind of ignores his own code a lot of the time. But I thought it was very appropriate and heartbreaking as hell for that specific iteration of Batman.
Like the Batman annual where he kills Ra's al Ghul and Robin says, "But you killed him," and he says, "Did I?" And it's like, well, yeah, because he just disintegrated in a spaceship.
Yeah.
So that's
yeah. The bad version of that is like Gotham. Like if you all watch Gotham, he killed Ra's al Ghul at least twice in season 4, and it's just. That's one of the examples where I'm like, it's poorly done. They don't understand the character.
But he didn't have to save him, Ryan. He didn't.
Well, it sounds like we've all played the Arkham games.
Yes.
If I had to guess, right?
Yes.
So I think probably one of the better examples of the killing question that has probably ever existed in Batman media is in the Most Wanted expansion for Arkham Knight, where you actually
I still need to play that.
You haven't played it?
I haven't played the DLC.
Well, I don't want to spoil it now. Son of a bitch.
I've at least played. I haven't played all of it, but I have played the Ra's. I made sure I got to the Ra's al Ghul one.
I knew Ra's al Ghul is in it, but I don't know the end.
Well, but that's the thing is that it is a scenario created in the game that actively gives the player a choice between letting him live or letting him die. And that's one of the things that I really like about it. And as someone who...
what would your Batman do? Right,
exactly. I mean, I generally think of myself as someone who will always favor trying to preserve life. But then, you think about it a little bit more, and the decision that I ultimately made comes from my understanding of Batman, and particularly in his interactions with Ra's, where Ra's has prolonged his life to such a degree that he is no longer on natural time. And the choice that I first made, before I went and played it again and saw how the other side of it played out, but the choice that I first made was to, I don't even think that it's killing him, it's stopping him from artificially prolonging himself even further. Because that's really the name of the game as to what Ra's does all the time. Is that really killing him, especially if he's already had 6 lifetimes?
Isn't that...
because with Ra's, it's a more complicated question.
Isn't that oh gosh, was that in like a Batman Incorporated arc? I know that was in the comics at one point where they went and destroyed all of the existing Lazarus pits.
All the Lazarus pits.
Yes. Yeah. That is true. But the thing that I really appreciate about what Rocksteady did in Arkham Knight with that is that it gave the decision to the player. And you could choose either one and have a fully realized ending to that part of the story, but each one also has its trade-offs. So it's a really nuanced way, and when you actually have to make the decision, it's a nerve-wracking moment because of what you're deciding to do in changing not just Ra's destiny, not just Batman's destiny, but potentially the destinies of everyone in the League of Assassins at that point. So it's a very well done sort of exploration of this question, and if you haven't played it, you should.
I just need to finish. I'm trying to think. I haven't played there was the Ra's al Ghul one, which was really good. I played the Mad Hatter one, and what were the other two? Because I haven't played
Freeze.
I didn't play Freeze yet.
Freeze is awesome.
Okay.
I actually
you know what? I'm stuck on the stupid Riddler thing. I can't beat I'm in the Catwoman thing where I'm trying to beat all the Riddler robots.
Okay, I'll have to talk to you about that.
That's super hard.
And
I finished all the Riddler stuff.
And I don't have a PS4, so if listeners out there, if you want to become a Patreon supporter of Comics Now so that I can buy a PS4
help their
and play
research
Arkham Knight.
division.
I don't think there's a shortage of people who can help walk you through it. I've 240%ed Arkham Knight 4 different times across Xbox One and PS4 now.
So we've done it on both systems.
This is why God invented Wikipedia. So I'll just head over there afterward.
Yeah.
Well,
Arkham VR too. That I think Chris, you've played it, right?
Oh yeah,
that one explores the Batman killing thing in a really interesting way as well.
Yeah, it does. I mean, the thing that's disorienting about it is that once you start to realize exactly what's going on, not only is it insane to actually be in Batman's cowl, effectively, like that moment where you're looking in the mirror and you see Batman looking back at you is singularly exciting if you're a Batman fan. And throwing batarangs in the Batcave is great.
Oh yeah.
But with that story, it makes him question his own competence to a point. I mean, it's a thread that's carried into the main story of Arkham Knight because Arkham VR is effectively a lead-in to the story told in Arkham Knight. It makes him question his own competence in his ability to be Batman, but it also confronts you with a very stark image of a nightmare scenario that totally revolves around this question. And really, it's kind of spoiler alert, but by the end of that story, the story that it tells basically comes away with the idea that if this wall falls down to a point where this spreads to his own allies, Batman ceases to exist. And it's a singularly compelling story that could only be told in virtual reality. Yes,
exactly. And I might add, one of the best Batman experiences I've ever had in any medium.
Yeah.
Like I just haven't played it because I just will not buy another piece of hardware just to play that one. Like
they have these things now. They have like VR arcades in a lot of places now. Like I'm in Raleigh and there's like 2 or 3 of them, and you can just like go there and like pay somebody some money to like play it, and it takes like an hour to beat. Or find a friend that has it or something.
It is pretty short.
And
I will say this too, because Scott, I agree with you. It wouldn't be one game, but as soon as they announced Star Trek Bridge Crew, I was like, 2 games? Oh. I'm in.
No, I bought a PSVR just for Arkham VR.
Well, see, I bought a PS4 just for Arkham Knight. So I even have like I even have the gunmetal Batman PS4
the version.
Yeah,
awesome.
Yeah,
I walked out with a lot of envious eyes, and I got to my car as quickly as possible because I did not want to be mugged in the parking lot.
Well, to the Batmobile.
Batmobile, yes.
And once again, that is patreon.com/comics.
Okay, so I think another thing that I would like to bring up in this argument, because I feel like, I don't know, I feel like there's one thing to be said for comics now, and I'm talking about mainline continuity comics, because I think Chris hinted at something earlier, and I agree. You go Elseworlds on me, I'm pretty much willing to kind of go with the flow. And, it's like people talk about Dark Knight Returns. Granted, I read that when I was 7. I had nightmares. You talked about the Batman Forever and the light shining on it. No, I had the leather-bound, Long Meadow pressed, complete Frank Miller Batman sitting on my shelf.
Oh, man.
And,
nice.
And my aunt gave it to me thinking, oh, it's Batman. Not realizing what Batman you just gave me.
Yeah.
And kind of going, I grew to love and appreciate where I read it annually, but still, it was like, that gives me chills. And you get Batman using a rifle, but it's really just a high-powered grappling gun. But you also get the scene where he comes through the wall and kind of gets that, the saw, and it's like, okay, what actually happens in that panel? Because you can it's kind of open to interpretation about what you think happens. And you also get him like snapping Joker's neck, but not snapping it all the way.
And then Joker does the rest.
And the Joker does the rest. Yeah. And so, and maybe with these Elseworlds, and I'll even go into the TV show and movies, I am maybe just a little bit more loosey-goosey in that I know when it doesn't feel right, but I just kind of still sit back and go, but it's not the comics, so, I'll let it go. Like, all the way back, I mean, you get the goons who get dehydrated in the Batman 66 movie.
Batman 66.
I'm like, you get some there. You get the machine guns that pop out of the Batmobile and the bombs and everything else in '89.
Careful. Every one of them has a mother.
Yeah.
Yeah, your point about Elseworlds is good, but the thing about that is who's really going to be reading Elseworlds stories, but more than likely people who are already familiar with characters in the comics. With movies,
and the thing about Elseworlds too is like you only going in a weird way with Elseworlds or making Batman kill people or whatever in Elseworlds. That's only a thing and only something that you do because it's of the way that he is in the comics. Because he doesn't kill in the comics, so it's like, well, let's explore it in the Elseworlds and trip it up and see what happens.
So I mean, seeing it in movies and seeing them as Elseworld stories. A friend of mine brought up that very point a couple of years ago, Scott, and I've kind of come around to seeing it like that. It's just this is just Elseworlds, an Elseworlds comic just on the big screen. The thing is, though, they're meant to reach the widest audience possible. Mm-hmm. So why wouldn't you want something that, I mean, in this whole conversation here, if this is a core tenet of his character, why wouldn't you want something that is so important to Batman to be represented well on the big screen or in television or what have you?
Well, but I guess it also becomes, I guess I fall a little bit more on the, okay, what's the story they're telling? And I could tell from Chris's comment relating to BVS as someone who absolutely adores that movie. And I'm looking at that story going, yes, it's wrong. And people are telling him that it's wrong. And it's because he has been broken and he's not the Batman we're supposed to know. And I'm watching it going, this makes me uncomfortable. But it's supposed to make me feel uncomfortable because he's doing the wrong thing. And I'm someone who, watching a story like that, I don't always need my heroes. If the point is about the heroes going down a dark path and having to get yanked back out of it, I don't mind my heroes getting their hands dirty. If the point is, yeah, we all acknowledge that, and we're like, stop it. You're not supposed to be doing this. And so I guess I'm okay with that, even though watching something going, well, that just feels kind of funny. Even the way of Batman Forever, where he flips the coin and Two-Face dies because he kind of knocks him off. It's like,
here's a bunch of coins, Harvey.
And so I look at all of this, and I'm just like, and I know I'm just kind of doing a scatter shot, but I basically just covered like every Batman movie ever made. But the point is that yes, it's not that rule. It's not, quote, right. But I guess, like you said, Jay, I'm taking that Elseworlds approach to it and going, I just let it go because I guess I just don't let it bother me that much. I guess there are things that just don't bother me as much as it does other people, which is why when these Twitter arguments flame up, I don't feel the need to jump in. I just kind of go, okay.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't feel the need to jump in on Twitter arguments either. It's generally a huge waste of time. But, I mean, I've also... I only recently posted a review that I wrote of Dawn of Justice because I wrestled for nearly 3 years whether or not I should even post this. And I ultimately decided to get this bear off my back because as much as I think there's a lot to like about it as a movie, I mean, Ben Affleck's performance in it is impeccable. Cinematography in it is beautiful. It's a very well-constructed movie. At least until you get to the runtime. But
well, it depends on whether you're talking about theatrical or Ultimate Edition.
Both.
Yeah.
The thing that ultimately ends up bothering me, and it's something that we've talked about before, is tone and intent behind the specific situations. And the reason that I brought up the using the front-mounted machine guns on the Batmobile as a differentiating factor between a scenario in which Batman is presented with the possibility of using lethal force is because in one scenario, it's careful, thought through, and measured. And in another one, it's wanton and it's disregarding of the lives that are in that car. And that's where the screenplay as written for Dawn of Justice particularly... I mean, I think Superman gets a shorter shrift in that movie than Batman does, but it's a core fundamental misunderstanding of Batman as he is long-standing in most of the source material because of the wanton disregard. It's one thing if he thought this through. It's another thing if he just gets the car out of the way so that he has a better shot to get to the semi-truck. And a lot of the biggest problems that I have with Dawn of Justice as well is just that as an audience, we're led to believe that Batman is operating in a harder-edged capacity than he was before, but a lot of it is not explicitly stated.
But I don't.
He may have been killing people his entire career. We don't know. It's never spelled out.
Well, at least until you see the extended version.
Well, but it's not even specifically
Partly.
spelled out there either. He just says that
Right.
he's operating in a way that has people more afraid of him than they used to be.
But
that could mean anything.
What? But I don't know.
I'm talking about the branding specifically.
Well, the branding is a whole other thing.
Right.
But when it comes to Batman's actual use of lethal force, it's all in the tone and the feeling that comes across from it. If it's wanton disregard for life, and if he's just going around killing, and we don't know that he hasn't been doing this for his entire career, partially because maybe Snyder and Chris Terrio planned to tell that story, but because they never got to, this is all the purest vision of Batman that we have as they saw him is Dawn of Justice, and as a movie on its own, I just don't think it holds water.
Well, see, I'll just staunchly disagree with you, and we'll just have one of these, agree to disagree things where, but I agree with you that there was a story that was being told that unfortunately got, chop blocked at the knees, where I believe those things were maybe going to be more explicitly said. I don't need it to be explicitly said because I'm looking at it with my understanding of the character and my understanding of what other characters are saying about the character, especially with, a little bit more explicitly said in the Ultimate Edition, where I do see this as Alfred says, new rules. And I just don't go there, so it doesn't bother me because I'm looking at this going, this seems new. Even Alfred's looking at him and being concerned,
but because it's not spelled out, that is still just supposition.
Well, but great. But I think that goes back into with my take in books and movies and stuff. I don't need things spelled out for me, and I can allow me to do that on my own.
But But you just said that if the core idea of the story is that Batman is now operating in a darker place, then that's a detail that shouldn't be glossed over. That's something that should be communicated to the audience.
Well, see, I think it is.
We can try and infer authorial intent based on little bits of information that we have. And I've defended the DCEU vision of Batman as something that could have been much more truly fulfilled in the fullness of time. But since we didn't get the fullness of time out of that, as it stands on its own, all we have is supposition that, well, they said this, so maybe this is how this is working. Maybe he just started killing people after he got driven over the deep end by enduring the death of a Robin. But because we don't know, and we don't know how that full story would have turned out, we're just left to judge what is there, and what is there does not give enough service to that arc or that point in his life.
Yeah, see, and what's there, I think, is enough for a lot of people, and a lot of people that are big fans of the movie. I'm a little bit closer to where you are, Chris, because I could see a lot of the places where they were going and the intent being there, and I although I don't need it like explicitly spelled out for me in some of the movies, I wanted it because Batman is my favorite character, and you're very explicitly subverting a lot of the things about him that have made him what he is over the years.
And just to be clear, I don't begrudge anybody for wanting that or for what is there being enough, but because it wasn't there. there's a lot of people who float those kinds of suppositions as hard facts when they're not. It's not in the dialogue. It's not in the screenplay. So as long as you're open with the fact that, yeah, this is what I'm pretty sure it was going to be, that's fine. But saying that this is what it is because of something we never saw is standing on some pretty loose foundation. But that does not mean that I fall in line with people who think that Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice is a cinematic atrocity. I do not believe that it is. Not anything close to it. Because I've seen actually bad movies. And I know what bad movies look like. And that's not a bad movie. But when it deals with these kinds of icons, then it invites closer scrutiny. It invites even closer scrutiny than Zack Snyder probably got on Watchmen, even though that was an adaptation of one single story. But that was also one piece of source material that did not have 75 plus years behind it.
Right.
So,
and I think that's why, I mean, that's had to have been something they were going for when they made BVS. And for me, I was like, at the end of it, I was like, okay, I'm not on board with this, but I think I'm not supposed to be on board with this. And at the time I was ready and willing to be like, okay, I want to see where it goes because they have a take on it. And I want to see it continue in terms of like prove it to me, like show, it's like finish the story. I want to see the whole thing. And to your point, Chris, you see what happens in BVS, and with your question of how long has he been doing this and new rules and things. And of course, when you see Justice League, you get the scene of J.K. Simmons Gordon being like, Batman would never do this. But who would, when they're talking about the parademon, Batman's never acted like this before. almost like he must have been out of town during BVS or something.
Well, we can talk about what all happened with that film and going back to your...
Exactly. And we know why it's not a good connection between the two films. And that's, for me, that's why it kind of brought it down, because I was like, I'm going to let this stand because I want to see where it goes. And of course, Justice League didn't really fulfill that.
And I guess
that
my point is that then I don't see the decisions that were made, out of the control of that movie to bring down that movie. I can still appreciate that movie for what it was and still kind of go, and instead of me looking at the story not being completed and bashing this movie, I get more upset about what happened afterwards and go back and still push the movie. And
history is going to be kind to it. I think that that's probably going to be the case. I mean, there's a reputation that it has for people who really just kind of want to stay away from it, or who, only get their marching orders for what movies they'll like from looking at a Rotten Tomatoes score. So, I mean, you can't change those people's minds. But since the legs basically got cut off for what was probably going to be a cinematic odyssey, if they actually had their way, then you can it'll be easier in years to come to look at Dawn of Justice and appreciate what it attempted to do with the time that it had. But because it didn't give that broader service to the reasoning behind Batman becoming a killer, that, in my mind, is what makes it fall short.
But once again, and this film seems to be, and the impetus for why this argument likes to be brought up on Twitter, because you want to get these fanboy wars. It's a
good impetus for most of them, like in lots of different. It's not just this conversation, and again, I think BVS is kind of made to be kind of a lightning rod discussion kind of movie.
But I think that's also why personally I adore it so much, is because it just makes me go, ooh, like it's not just it's not just standard fare. And I'm talking about cinematically, and I'm not talking about just Batman. I'm talking about just movies, but then what you get, and I feel like needs to be brought up in this conversation, and I feel like people really like to start to nitpick, and I'm like, dudes, just watch a movie, just watch a movie. But then you want to start what most people of a certain age, I don't know, then of course want to directly compare it to the previous incarnation, which is the Nolan trilogy.
Right, I was about, and the reason the comparison is there, I think the fact that the Dark Knight trilogy is immediately preceding BVS, it makes that argument that much stronger, because if you had like Batman 89, Batman Returns BVS, you could, I mean, there's more of a through line in terms of the interpretation, I guess, kind of. But the fact that the Dark Knight trilogy largely explores this no guns, no, I mean, that's where the line comes from in The Dark Knight Rises. He's like, no guns, no killing. And it's explored in all three movies, right? In The Dark Knight, the Joker's whole plan is, tonight you're going to break your one rule. And Batman Begins. And again, a lot of that speaks to my personal Batman sensibilities, is that I like the fact that the story went there. You know, that scene where Bruce Wayne walks up to the dock, he has that gun. He tried to use a gun. He tried to kill Joe Chill, and that was taken away from him. And he's holding that gun and he throws it into the river. And that's just such a big part of that story, and it's part of the trilogy. And that trilogy focuses on it so much that I think it heightens that discussion by the time that the first Batman you see after that is what you see in Dawn of Justice.
But within, and I want this to be made clear, I adore that trilogy. I love it. I own it. I own it in multiple editions. I've seen it many times. But you can even see the inconsistencies within the trilogy itself, where there are guns on the Bat Pod and the Bat, and like there are guns on his vehicles, which I don't criticize the film for that, because cinematically there's been weapons on all the vehicles almost, except for like maybe Forever and Batman and Robin, where there was just too much neon to worry about having guns on those vehicles. And even the whole, and I will say this, even in the theater in 2005, the whole "I don't have to save you" didn't sit well with me, but it didn't ruin the movie for me. It just kind of made me go, really? Nah, moving on. And that kind of thing. Now, saving Joker at the end of The Dark Knight fit with that, but then knocking Harvey off 5 minutes later, knocking Harvey off the thing and kind of killing him, does that bill, and then you kind of, shooting the road out from underneath Talia's truck in Dark Knight Rises, and that leading to her death. There are instances that people can point to, and I think legitimately can point to, if you're trying to win an argument. And I'm not trying to win an argument. I'm just saying, listen, it gets a little loosey-goosey here or there, and how much you're willing to forgive it is kind of like how much you're invested in trying to take a side or win an argument. And that's what I'm not trying to do. I'm just trying to say it kind of happens in all these movies. And so can we stop trying to have a measuring contest and try to, quote, win, in these arguments? Because at least in cinematic portrayals, it's there in some capacity, whether it's, choosing not to save them or taking action that maybe doesn't directly kill them but does kind of lead to their death. You get into some gray area there. And I just kind of let it wash over me because I'm just watching the movie. And, I know some people will get all in a tizzy about that. And great. If you want to get a tizzy in that, you can get in a tizzy about that. Just don't at me, because I'm not interested. I'm not interested in getting in a tizzy.
I'm of two minds about it. But Jay, you haven't chimed in a while.
I know.
I'm interested in what you have to say.
About Batman versus Superman, or just anything in general?
Just whatever.
Everything.
No. Oh, yeah, I know. I kind of wanted to reel back on that because I'm kind of done talking about the movie, no matter what. But I mean, to play, I guess, not like both sides of the fence here, but you could go about it a couple different ways here. The intent, let's say, of Batman versus Superman, it could at least make some sense. If you look at it as this is a Batman at the end of his career, the fact that we didn't get any stories before this, and this was the first story with that Batman, and that was our introduction to him, was probably more at fault than anything else, that's how they decided to introduce us to that Batman. But just to play the devil's advocate there, in the story, if it was supposed to be, here's a Batman who's gone too far and needs to come back, that makes sense. all this stuff drove me crazy when Keaton did it. Even Kilmer with throwing the quarters and the coins and everything. And even in the Nolan trilogy.
He brought the whole fistful of coins. He was going to, he premeditated that.
I don't know if he necessarily premeditated that he was going to, throw it when they were in like some pit where he could fall, but it was at least maybe something where, he could confuse Harvey so they could subdue him. But I mean, even then it's like,
should have just brought a magnet.
Exactly. But even in the Nolan trilogy, which is probably the stories that have touched on it the most, but even then it doesn't. So I give them credit for that. And again, I love those movies. Dark Knight's one of my favorite movies ever. Batman Begins is, probably one of the, let's just say, best Batman stories on screen, just as a thematic whole.
A great origin film.
Yeah, exactly. It's a great Batman origin. It's a great story just about Batman. But even though they explored this in the movies, they didn't really come to a satisfying conclusion either. Because, even in like in The Dark Knight Rises, he tells Catwoman, no guns and no killing. But then she saves him from Bane by, killing him.
Right. Blowing him away.
I appreciate that they at least tried to broach the subject. I don't think that they necessarily satisfactorily explored it or even came down on one side or the other about it. But again, I'm just waiting for the day that we get an on-screen Batman that doesn't need to go that route, because it really just comes down to the writers. The writers could have put him in a different situation, but they didn't. And really, that's what you could say about any movie. Is like, well, this couldn't have happened because they're fictional characters, and you could have just come up with a different story. And it's the same thing here. So I'm just waiting until somebody gets maybe and I'm going to bring back up what we talked about off mic earlier. But what effectively started this whole ordeal was me jokingly saying that George Clooney's Batman was the best cinematic Batman because he doesn't kill, so therefore he's the most accurate to comics. And that kind of just set off a whole thing. It was clearly a joke, mind you, but...
Maybe not clear enough. I don't know.
But, I mean,
it is Twitter,
if you're going to go that route, then yeah, even Adam West Batman, who I love that iteration of Batman, and I love the movie and the TV show and the comics and everything, even he accidentally caused a few goons to come to their demise. So even he has, some blood or, dust on his hands, let's say, with them being dehydrated. But no, I mean, it's just looking at if this is supposed to reach the widest audience and say this is what this character is about, and if we're going to say that not killing, not using guns, and doing anything that he can in any situation to save somebody from doom, we have yet to reach that, and I'm waiting for that in an on-screen portrayal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the things I said I was of two minds on it, and I don't really buy this what I'm about to say, but one way that I have heard some people rationalize what happened in the Dark Knight trilogy is that it goes back to personal responsibility. Would Ra's have been on the train if not for trying to destroy the city?
Mm-hmm.
No. Would Two-Face have been on that precipice if he wasn't trying to make Gordon pay for what happened to him? No. Would Talia have been in that truck if she wasn't trying to destroy Gotham with a nuclear weapon? No. Batman stopped all of those three things. And you could make an argument that they did it to themselves. He just he extracted himself from the situation and stopped what they were trying to do. Again, that's a pretty shaky argument, I think, is pretty safe to say. But
it is
one
worth
way I've heard
up, though. At least
it's Right. It's one way.
A fitting
I've heard...
kind for their end. And for their kind.
No. I like the first one better.
Deep cut. But then, my second mind is exactly what Jay said, is that all of these adaptations on this particular issue are flawed. Because for whatever reason, whenever Batman makes the transition into cinema, someone on the film's creative team feels a need for him to take a life in some respect or another. And so far, I think the closest that we've gotten to effectively exploring the psychology that holds up the quote-unquote one rule is the Nolan trilogy, which is probably why they're my favorite Batman movies. Dark Knight is my second favorite film of all time. But it, again, like Jay alluded to and like Scott alluded to as well, it is flawed. And the trilogy is flawed because it doesn't adequately put a situation in front of Batman where he can stop death from taking place.
This is why my favorite Batman movie is Mask of the Phantasm.
Yeah. Hey.
Yeah.
There you go. I mean, it's right there. But, I mean, modern comics, too, have done a lot in... even in the DC universe. In fact, probably over the last couple of years, especially in the DC universe. I mean, at the beginning of Tom King's run on Batman, I was not the biggest fan of what he was doing. It wasn't until his second full arc, I believe, that I fully got on board with what he was doing. And that arc was I Am Suicide. Mm-hmm. And that
Great
was
arc.
one, I think, yeah. And I think it was a really effective explanation for positioning the drive behind what he does in a childlike context that he knows is in a childlike context, but this is just the way that he chooses to answer what happened to him, and he effectively chooses to die every night that he goes out there. I thought that was an extraordinarily unique way of putting it, and an effective one in explaining where his psychology is at. And the one rule is a part of that. It's a pretty big component of that, because he knows that the ideology that he's crafted as Batman has roots in the mind of a child. He doesn't care, because he still has that mission to fulfill. And not killing criminals, I mean, I think it was really effectively explored too in Grant Morrison's run on Batman. I mean, I was actually in the audience at Comic-Con International. There was a Batman panel that had Morrison and Paul Dini and I think Mike Martz, who was the editor at the time. Yeah. And someone asked him from the audience about, why doesn't Batman use a gun? Pretty stupid question. And Morrison shouted at the guy, shouted down at him saying, never, never. That's the whole point, is that he doesn't use weapons. And the fan tried talking, and people were booing him and telling him to sit down. And Morrison said, if he uses a gun, he's just another soldier. And we don't need a soldier. We need Batman.
Very nice.
And I don't know if it could be put any better. I mean, of course, Grant Morrison is a much better writer and orator than I could ever be. But he really boiled it down in a concise way that was consistent throughout his entire run and canonized the reasoning behind the existence of this rule and why it's a constant source, not just for keeping the stories going and helping them to subsist, but why it's something that he chooses to forego in his career. And it also came up, issue number 8, Peter Tomasi's Batman and Robin.
Great run.
And I
love that run. I think it's an underrated. It's a wonderful,
it is
extremely underrated run.
He's a great
extraordinarily underrated.
I have the omnibus, and it is gloriously gorgeous.
And I mean, people should reread it constantly, because it is a great exploration of not just the dynamic between Bruce and Damian, but the reasoning behind they do what they do. And I read issue number 8 because I was working at a comic shop at the time. I read it over and over again because of that moment where it's the issue, I believe, right after Damian kills Nobody. And Batman says to him, there's an old proverb that says, if you walk down a road of vengeance, then you should dig 2 graves, one for your enemy and one for yourself. You can't build a better world by killing criminals. It bankrupts your soul and societies by reinforcing the same cycle of violence. And Damien, he's still struggling with it. He says, I want to believe it. I'm just not sure that I can. And Bruce tells him, you have to believe it. You have to live it from here on out for my sake and for yours.
Well, and that's why Damien is such a great Robin to have in the comics, introduced by Grant and then really very well fleshed out by Peter Tomasi. But because when you have Batman's own blood, Batman's own son, raised by the League of Assassins, with Ra's al Ghul as his grandfather, and that is the child, that is the sidekick.
He's been raised as a killer.
He's been raised as a killer. That's, I think, what makes that Tomasi Gleason run of Batman and Robin so powerful, because it's exploring this father-son relationship where the father's trying to save the son, but damn, you've got years of programming to have of instinct to have to break through. And that makes that run so good. And which is why I really do. I know people want to give Damien crap all day long, but that's why under a good writer, and Tomasi writes Damien. Tomasi's my favorite writer of Damien. I'm going to say that.
Oh yeah, no question.
But his ability to explore that. And then, even in kind of a fun way, when he gets to Super Sons, it's still dealing with that, and it being Batman's own son, who is now his Robin, and him trying to impart that lesson onto him, I think is just some damn good writing.
Yeah, and that even goes back to the heart of Robin. I mean, that's a bigger conversation too. But like, Robin is supposed to be this person that always is at Batman's side, that constantly makes him reevaluate what he's doing and be the kind of person that can pull him back out of the darkness when he gets too deep.
Well, and that's it. It just further shows that there's a significant amount of creative material that can absolutely be mined and given the larger pedestal of a movie by sufficiently exploring these questions without necessarily having to break that rule. It would, at this point, it's expected that a Batman movie will break that rule. It would be going against the grain to actually adhere to it in a way that is recognizable to modern source material.
Well, and that is something that I would look forward to. Like, I guess the thing is that I am not going to sit here and personally damn the way it's been done, while I can still also go, but wouldn't it be cool if? Wouldn't it be cool to see that cinematic version that really just nails it in every facet?
It would be
absolutely.
very
It confronts it head on, and that puts you in a situation where you've got to write yourself out of it. And if you do it well, it could be amazing.
Well, and you can do both. You can really appreciate what's come before, which I think to varying degrees we all do. But you can also still hope for that more perfect adaptation at some point to come.
Exactly. And I think what you just said, Chris, is, and I'm gonna get a little judgy here, but I think that that's the healthy mindset to take, instead of trying to, I don't know, feel like there has to be a side. I mean, I feel like here we have 4 people here on this podcast episode with, we each have a different flavor of where we kind of, what we find tolerable, what we don't find tolerable, what's kind of a hard line in the sand. But you notice that at no point have we just started yelling and trying to shut the other person up. Because we're not trying to win anything.
I don't know. I saw Ryan mute his mic a lot. Who knows?
I don't know.
I don't buy it. I don't buy it at all.
No,
but
I'm just kidding.
But the point is that it is a discussion worth having when we go, well, we can all look at things and go, well, none of these, particularly cinematic interpretations, have been perfect. And if we don't try to argue that they're perfect, if we don't feel like we have to justify them, which I'm guilty of some justifying, because when someone wants to attack me for a version that I I can appreciate, but I don't have to feel like, but I'm also not saying that you're wrong and I'm right. I'm just saying you do you and me do me, and we'll go along. But like you said, Chris, but we can all continue to look forward to that. When's going to be that one that we can all just kind of go, oh, yes,
Yeah.
you did it.
Well, and it's debate 101, folks. If you want to have a good and solid and constructive conversation about something that you might disagree with someone on, you attack ideas, not people.
And you have
That's just the core fundamental.
that.
And you have the understanding of the idea that you're against, to where you can speak intelligently.
And not the idea that you're wrong.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Right, because at the end of the day, we can all go away going, okay, we understand each other. We don't have to agree with each other. We don't have to sing Kumbaya around the fire. But we can go, cool. I know where you stand. I know where I stand. We can all agree that we would like to see something in the future a little bit more in tune with the accepted canon of the comics. And wouldn't that be a great day? Wouldn't that be a wonderful day when we all just kind of go, damn, this was perfect.
Yeah.
Because, I'm kind of curious, though, because I did bring it up, and Chris was like, oh, God, when I brought up year 2. I'm just kind of curious. Why did you have that reaction?
I was flipping through that today.
I had that reaction not because I think it's some rash violation. I really didn't like the Reaper as a character. I read that story cover to cover. I think I read it in succession with year 1. And first of all, I don't think it gets anywhere near being a correctly intoned sequel to my favorite Batman story of all time.
Yeah.
But
and it wasn't made to, unfortunately.
Right.
Like, they were like, we got this other story, and it comes out right after year 1. Let's slap year 2 on it.
Yeah, the way that I would always point people, if you wanted to, at least pre-New 52 when I was working at a comic shop, if you want to get a good understanding of canonized early Batman, you read year 1, you read The Man Who Laughs by Ed Brubaker and Doug Mahnke.
Oh, that's a great story.
Then you read Long Halloween, and then you read Dark Victory. And after you have all that, then go back and read Dark Moon Rising. And that will give you a really good baseline for what Batman's early years are perceived to be in the modern age. And when you throw year 2 in there, obviously it didn't stick around as the canon year 2 for very long.
Because Victory rewrites it completely.
Yeah, exactly. They're very there are conflicting things that occur between Fear the Reaper and Long Halloween and Dark Victory. But as a story, it did not live up to the hype that year subtitle had already, even by that point, cultivated.
Well, wasn't it pretty much a story that they just slapped the year 2 title on?
Yeah,
like that.
Exactly
I think Mike W. Barr, is he the one who wrote it?
Yes, he was.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure it was a story he already had planned, and because year 1 was so popular, editorial just said, "Hey, let's slap a year 2 title on this," and that's that's exactly what happened. So it's not even like they were meaning it to be the definitive second year of Batman story.
No, and it's
Right.
not.
And it is
I just read it tonight for the
crazy
first time.
Bananas.
Oh, really?
Yes, I bought the 30th anniversary deluxe edition a couple of years ago at a Black Friday sale at my local.
I've got it sitting right here.
My local comic book shop. By the way, if anyone's interested, it is free to borrow on Comixology Unlimited. You can if you pay for that, you can borrow that sucker and read it cover to cover for quote free. But it's a story that my only interest was because it was the inspiration for Reaper, was sort of the base prototype for Phantasm, and so that was my only reason for reading the book. And then seeing him holding a gun on the cover of the 30th anniversary edition made me go, obviously I need to read this before this podcast tonight because I'm kind of curious.
It's an entertaining story and well worth reading. It's not a great Batman story, though.
It's not. It really isn't. I'm not going to be kind to it on my Goodreads review when I get done recording this podcast. But it's I've seen that kind of. I think the point though is if you're going to have Batman with a gun, particularly the gun that killed his parents, which I thought was an interesting twist.
Right.
I've seen it done better. And I think that goes back to a statement I made all the way at the beginning of this episode, which is, how well do you do it? You get a lot more rope if you do it well. And that didn't do it well for me. I would say there was, here's a callback. There was that one particular short in the Gotham Knight animated film, that anime anthology movie that they did, that I thought explored that a lot more compellingly. With him coming out of the sewer with all the guns that have been dumped in the sewer, and then going into the short that's all about him fighting Deadshot and him kind of exploring the concept of the gun. And I thought that was a much more intriguing psychological exploration, other than I got my ass handed to me in one fight against one guy, and all of a sudden I'm going to whip out a gun.
You mentioned Deadshot. I actually read Deadshot Beginnings this past week for another podcast I'm going to be on later this week. And there's actually a issue in there that actually explores a lot of this too, with a lot of Batman's internal monologue about how he refuses to use guns and doesn't want to do it. So, even this was back in the 70s and 80s. It was still a hard and fast rule, but it was interesting because there's a situation in there where Julia Pennyworth was her adoptive father was killed by Deadshot. And so she goes out seeking revenge, and Deadshot is trying to kill her as well because of some sort of paintings that were stolen by the Nazis or something like it. It was really weird. But ultimately, Batman's having to effectively fight against two people who want to kill somebody else while he refuses to use guns. And he kind of brings it about Deadshot's fall and Julia's redemption in an interesting way, in that she's about to fire at Deadshot, but Batman throws a batarang and knocks the gun to the side, and it discharges and hits Deadshot in the leg, and he falls out of a tree or something. Is pretty entertaining, but I just I think that was I don't even remember why I was bringing that up, other than you mentioned Deadshot, and yeah, it's a good exploration, because even in Deadshot's first appearance, he propped himself up as a hero so he could get at Batman, so he could discredit Batman. But Deadshot said that he was a hero using gun tricks to take out villains, like shooting signs to make it fall on villains and whatever. But just interesting that that's a better exploration of whether Batman should use guns or not, better than Year 2 is.
Well, and while I'm sacrificing, sacred cows at this point, not really kind of going into the no gun rule, but kind of going into the no killing rule. We kind of joked about the whole "is Joker dead?" ? Tune in to the next issue kind of deal. And I'm going to offer up to Filet, because you can poke holes in it if you want, Batman the Animated Series. Cover your ears, dear listeners, because I'm even willing to look at that if I want to, with a critical eye and go, you punch Joker into a water with a shark and you did nothing to try to save him in The Laughing Fish.
Well, I love in the World's Finest crossover when that...
Oh, yes! I was gonna...
When Harley's like, Puddin', and he's like, at this point, he probably is. That is
probably
cold-blooded, Bruce. Come on.
I've thought about that. There's also the...
Oh, that's great.
Oh, no,
I need to rewatch that.
Oh, yeah, it's part 3 of World's Finest. And then there's also the end of Mad Love when they're fighting on top of the train, and he just
knocks him into
and he punches him, and he goes down the smokestack, and it's like, if I want to pick this to death, I can, but it's like, But you could see someone going, and my whole point is not to belittle the animated series because, dear God, I will die on the hill of the animated series. It is, if I can point to one thing that made me the Batman fan I am today, it's the animated series, because I was there from day one and I watched every episode of, first airing live. Like that's what I did.
I've told people this before. I have VHS tapes from when I was a kid.
I have the Robin tape, the Riddler tape, the Joker tape. Oh yeah. But my point is that if we want to nitpick something to death, we can nitpick almost any iteration of the character, with the exception of, canonized, in continuity stories. There's anything that we can point at and go, really? It's like that great line from Dark Knight Returns where it's like, rubber bullets. Honest. It's like everything can kind of go, okay, we're going to wink at this away that we just punched Joker into a smokestack, or we make a comment like World's Finest, because Jay, you stole that from me, and gloriously so, because that's where, no, don't apologize. Well played, sir. But the point is that you can point at that and go, seriously, like, if we're going to stand by this whole no killing thing, that really doesn't play well. Like, let's make a better writing choice if we want to really try to, hold this up. But my point is just to go, we can nitpick anything. So let's stop trying to hold everything. Like, once again, going back to winning the argument of this version of the character is perfect. No, the writers made a choice every once in a while that kind of blemishes it a little bit. But still, if I'm going to say who's my Batman, Kevin Conroy in the animated series, because that's the most Batman version I've got, and I love it. Yeah. And if you take your examples too of the Joker, we have an ending for the Joker too in that storyline, and it ties into this too. So like if you watch Batman Beyond: Return of the Joker, the unedited, either the edited or the unedited version, but specifically the unedited version, you have a brainwashed, manipulated Tim Drake killing the Joker with his own weapon, right? So, and the fact that he does that, like, it's got all this trauma and stuff, but associated with it, but the fact that he killed the Joker with a weapon like that, I think, kind of tied it into how Batman's relationships kind of fell apart with a lot of his Bat family, in addition to everything else that gets set up in that story too. So I thought that was an interesting point in terms of that, that code kind of seeping into that story too. Oh yeah, because it kind of goes back to like, yeah, Batman doesn't kill people, Batman doesn't use guns, but Batman can damage some people in different ways. Even the people he's trying to help, he damages them, which I think makes him, for me, I know it sounds like awful, but he's a compelling character for that. Because it's like, dude, that really didn't help. And I'm sorry, I get a pit in my stomach every time I watch that flashback scene in Return of the Joker. It's just like, that hurts me so much.
Yeah, me too. As a Tim Drake fan, definitely. Yeah.
You mean Jason Todd with Tim Drake's name?
Yes, that's exactly what I mean.
Yeah. But I think that's part of, like, all these stories and all these examples. You get all of these stories, and we have all these discussions because this rule is there to start with. And I don't think, at the end of the day, like, your philosophy may differ, but for me, I'm glad it's there because we get all of this philosophical stuff that kind of gets attached to Batman.
Agreed.
And I think he's a very good canvas of a character for these kinds of stories and these kind of discussions. So I'm glad that it's there, and I'm glad that we have so much history and legacy there to dive into.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm glad, like we were talking earlier, with those editorial mandates and the self-censorship, because of these limitations on the character, writers had to get much more creative. And Batman really, I mean, I am a staunch believer that if those choices had not been made, I don't even know if we would know who Batman is anymore. I mean, in all honesty, if they had just gone the way they had been going with their early stories, that may have wrung out, some good stories for a couple of years, but it would not be the Batman that we know and love. And in fact, he may have just died out with the rest of the pulp hero craze, into the early 40s.
Or got like a complete reinvention, like a Flash or a Green Lantern or something like that. Like get a secondary
he would be a member of the Justice Society of America,
popular one, right?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, there is one inescapable and fundamental truth, and that is that Batman is eternal. I think that over the course of his entire history, he's proven that Batman is virtually a different thing to almost every person who thinks about it for more than 5 minutes. And it's one of the beauties of the character is that sort of malleability over time, that he can be different things at different times, and he is always of his time. And it's different stewards of the character who have done different things with him, but there's always some fundamental core aspect that connected with them that then inspires them to keep the fire alive, so to speak. And that's one of the things that I always really value about who Batman is, especially compared with virtually every other superhero, is that he has the flexibility to be so many different things to so many different people across so many different demographics. It's something that I think is largely unique to him. And that's not something that's going to be taken away anytime soon. Batman's going to be around long after we are. And who knows what other forms this particular conversation with him will take.
And I want to bring up, I think, a nice little cap to what you just said, Chris, which is my favorite quote I've ever heard about Batman and kind of this discussion. And it was at San Diego Comic-Con. Frank Miller was on a panel, and I believe it was a young lady who came up to the mic and said, and was asking Frank, what's the best version of Batman? And Frank's response was, which one's your favorite? And that was his answer to the question.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's true. It's pretty much true.
It's true.
I mean, this discussion could go on and on and on, but I think we've hit pretty much everything I wanted to. Does anybody else have anything else that they think they can't live without?
No, because I think we've hit all the standard talking points, the ones that, the Twitter would normally bring up. But also
Twitter.
Enlightened by also some deeper polls and examples that kind of contextualize what this whole discussion is around.
Right. Exactly. So, I mean, it's definitely, it's a discussion that's, I think we put a good pin in it, but I don't think it's ever going to end, and nor should it, because that's how you continue to get more stories and more explorations on this topic and on this theme. And again, I mean, I would say for better or for worse, but I'm going to say for better. It's part of the fabric of the character of Batman. And I think it's going to keep him going because it's something that certainly will always be a discussion in today's world, for sure. And I think it's important that it's there for Batman. It's there for a character to kind of speak to different, like Chris was saying, different generations, different people that are reading the stories at different stages in their lives or across the board. I think it's going to keep making good stories. So I think that's a positive.
You always got to keep bringing new blood in. That's the name of the game. If you want these characters to persist into the future, then they're always going to have to try and appeal to new and forthcoming generations. And some of us old fogies in time will probably not like that very much.
Hey, as the oldest person here, I take offense to that statement. Stop it with your ageism.
But, I mean, at the end of the day, the transition to to a new generation is always difficult. So you
Yeah,
want
and just
Batman to
look
keep
at
going.
Batman.
Yeah, exactly.
Through the generations, like they have their own little identity that kind of goes with them. You know, some are better than others, I guess, but I think as long as the integrity of the characters there and they approach it the best that they can in the time that they are stewards of the character, I think it'll always end up, even sometimes if it doesn't at the time seem like this is a good or great direction, it'll always be interesting to go back and look and analyze, you know, those eras of the character later on.
And what's
too.
great is when you have new creators come in, even if they try something new and it doesn't work, you can just go back to the way things were that do. And
right.
I mean,
next Wednesday there's another comic book.
One thing that it sounded like we were going to touch on way early in the conversation, but just kind of want to bring up here was that was kind of the entire point of Azrael as Batman. Just to say, this is why a brutal, murderous Batman doesn't work, and to bring him back to the status quo. So that perfectly fits in with we can make these changes and then see what works. And there were some great stories in there, and that whole story itself was fantastic.
I think Nightfall is probably one of the best explorations of this topic in a large scale, because the whole story is born out of the desire to see how readers would react to a Batman who had the capacity to kill. And although they don't really touch the gun thing, it's more about like you said, a potentially murderous Batman, and
Bane exploits his quote unquote weakness. That's what he uses. You know, he recognizes he's not going to kill these villains, so let's just release all of them to wear him out, and then go into some even deeper. Some deeper issues about Batman trusting the other members of the Bat family, which could be an entire podcast unto itself and everything. But I mean, that like you were saying, that was almost a perfect encapsulation of what this whole should Batman be brutal / murderous, and why it really doesn't work, at least for Bruce Wayne under the cowl.
And what a great meta conversation to be having in the 90s.
Exactly.
With the trend in 90s comics at the time, it's metafiction at its finest of let's deal with this trend in 90s comics, and how does that look when you have Batman? And what did readers cry out? We want Bruce back.
Yeah. I mean, it was literally
to Denny O'Neil's joy. He was like, I hope this is a gamble, and I hope that they like the Batman that we want to have, and not
exactly, because it was literally them saying, okay, here, we're going to give you what you want, now let's see if it is actually what you really want.
And although Nightfall is this giant story, if you like Jay mentioned earlier, like if you go back in Night's End, and if you only read one book out of the whole thing, read the very last part of Night's End, of the main story, with I think it's called Climax. It's in Legends of the Dark Knight. It's written by Denny O'Neil, which is interesting because he didn't write the bulk of the issues for Nightfall, because of course he was the group editor, kind of overseeing the whole story. But he did write the final part of the Nightfall trilogy or whatever, and it's this very insular story. It's just Batman and Azrael duking it out in the Batcave. And it's more of a philosophical battle than an, fist-to-fist thing. And it's all about this question of who is Batman and what makes Batman important and that kind of thing. So, yeah, it's a really good, that whole storyline. And that's what Nightfall's about. It's not necessarily about, Bane and all that stuff. Of course, that's what it gets the most attention for. But this philosophical debate of which Batman would you rather have be Batman is at the heart of why the story even exists.
And if you want an even more digestible version of the story, you could approach it the way I did, which was reading the Denny O'Neil novelization.
The novelization.
Which is what I read off of a $5 mass market paperback off of a Walmart rack one summer.
I got it for like $6 at a bookstore on like their clearance rack back in like 96 or something, and I've had it ever since.
Oh man. There's also the 3-hour radio drama, which I am very partial to. I enjoy that quite a bit. Cool. Well, I think this was exactly what I wanted out of this conversation. a lot of good discussion going on. So I guess if anybody else does any other little points, I think we could move on to some plugs and get out of here. So Chris, you got anything to plug?
You can find me on Twitter at Chris Clow, ChrisClow. I'm currently developing the next episode of my comic book video game podcast, Comics on Consoles, which is going to be about 1994's The Death and Return of Superman that was released on the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis.
Sunsoft.
Very first sort of retro game that I've covered on the show, so that should be a lot of fun. Hopefully I'll have that done in couple of months.
Be kind.
It takes a long time.
Be kind. I love that game.
Don't worry.
The box art is so good for that.
That game defined so much of my time with the Super Nintendo that I love it. Spoiler alert, I like that game a lot. Also have just today, the day that we're recording this, which is Sunday, February the 18th, or I guess now it's the night. It's Monday the 18th. Yeah, yesterday was Sunday the 17th. Put out a new episode of Discovery Debrief, Star Trek podcast, where me and 3 other awesome panelists discuss all of the new episodes of Star Trek Discovery that are coming out, and we have an episode that just discussed episodes 3 and 4 of season 2. So it was a lot of fun. Check that out if you like the Star Trek.
Nice. What about you, Jay?
You can find me personally on Twitter at JAYAWS. And like I said, my site and podcast is comics-now.com. On Twitter and Instagram at comicsnowcast. Find me over there just weekly talking about comics on the show and doing reviews and press releases and some videos with merch reviews and things like that over on the website. And I'm also, like Ryan said earlier, I'm on Everyone Loves Young Justice, that podcast with Rob Myers. You can find us on iTunes and on Twitter at ELYJ Podcast. And so check us out over there talking about both the 98 Young Justice series and all the little tie-ins with that, and the 2019 Wonder Comics imprint version of the Young Justice run as well.
Awesome. Cool. And Scott, what you got?
Well, you can find me personally on Twitter at ScottDC27. You can, of course, listen to me weekly, usually dropping on Saturday or Sunday, depending on when we record, on the Suicide Squadcast, where we will discuss mainly DCEU movie news. But while any DC Universe live action show is dropping, we do weekly discussions of that. So you can tune into our review of episode 1 of Doom Patrol.
Doom Patrol.
Yes. And then, of course, you can visit suicidesquadcast.com to find the entire network of shows. Give them all a listen. They're all great guys, and I don't say that because I have to. I say that because I want to.
Trademark.
Suicide Squadcast LLC, 2019.
Right. Cool. Well, I couldn't thank you guys enough for coming on the show. I think everybody's going to get something out of the discussion, and again, I'm glad that we're able to use BOF as a platform for discussions like this. It's always fun to do these like off the beaten path. It's not a news show. Again, somebody can listen to this 5 years from now and it still be relevant when that Twitter thread pops back up again. We could just be like, here, listen
Copy,
to this.
paste.
2.5 hours. Yeah, done that. See you later. Homer Simpson seeps back into the so I guess that wraps up today's episode. And for Chris, Jay, and Scott, I'm Ryan. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
Hey now! You've been listening to the Batman on Film podcast, a proud member and the sponsor of the Batman Podcast Network, BatmanPodcastNetwork.com. You can listen to the BOF Podcast on iTunes, YouTube, Stitcher, Google Play Music, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, TuneIn, and wherever good podcasts like this one can be found. Want to advertise on the BOF podcast? Go to advertisecast.com/the Batman on Film Con podcast. Follow Jet on Twitter at Batman on Film and on BOF's Facebook fan page at facebook.com/jet.batmanonfilm. Email Jet via jet@batman-on-film.com. I'm announcer Rachel. Thanks for listening.